Chapter 2142. This time, what Zhang Yan saw was very different from the last two times. Instead of a group of living people, he saw a group of demons. The demons were all in human form, prostrating themselves in worship of a greater demon. Although the person they were worshipping was different, and the ritual they used was different from what he had seen before, it was fundamentally the same. So, it really is him, he thought. By now, he was sure that this was what Zhizhuang Daoren was doing. It also confirmed his suspicions that severing the Taoist magic to prevent that entity from returning had not been his true goal. Everything he had done had been to make a big deal out of it. However, the demons in human form were a bit strange. In the past, most high-grade Taoists had been human cultivators. That was because the human body was the most suitable form for Taoist cultivation. However, after the Taoist magic was severed, there was no need for demons to assume human form. Therefore, such a method seemed unnecessary. Furthermore, Zhizhuang could easily come up with a set of rules that would make it easier for the demons to prostrate themselves in worship. In fact, he could even use a different method, which would make it less likely that he would reveal himself. After a moment's thought, he came to a conclusion. Although Tao techniques were extinct now, that was only done by the lotus of good fortune. What was broken was only a minor Tao. The true Tao actually did not change much. Even deity refinement cultivators could be considered as people who pursued Tao. They were also pursuing Tao themselves, so how could there be any change? The human form was the most compatible with the fundamental nature of the great Tao. That was why it had been the easiest for living people to reach the higher realms. Although outsiders and demons were innately powerful, few were able to pluck high-grade Tao fruits. From what he could tell, none of the fellow Taoists he had encountered were demons. From that, it seemed that Zhizhuang Daoren had a profound reason for doing this. Although the method seemed simple, it actually led to a great Tao. As for who the ritual was worshipping, it didn't matter. Whether it was an immortal or a devil god, it was all for the sake of helping living beings pass the test of understanding, and then guiding them to assume human form. Once they passed the initial stage, they would be able to control the more complicated ritual. The various sects and clans of the mountain and sea realm used all sorts of magical techniques to give their disciples of the younger generation divine abilities and magical power. However, they were all minor Taoists. Although they could live forever and could wield powerful divine abilities, such methods were completely unrelated to the great Tao. If Zhizhuang's method were to be passed down and spread throughout the worlds, it would very likely fill the gap left behind by the retreat of Tao laws. He wasn't sure what Zhizhuang wanted to do, but from these traces and his own senses, he was sure that it had something to do with him finding his Weili. Thus, he had to find a way to delay this matter. From what had happened to Creation Pauline, he could tell that once she regained her power, she would no longer speak nicely to you. Instead, she would use force to oppress you. However, it was not appropriate to obstruct him on the surface, so he should fight against him on Tao techniques. After a moment's thought, he decided that it would be best to create a magical incantation that he could release into the world of mortals to be cultivated. Originally, he had created a technique that didn't require any external objects to cultivate. However, it wasn't a complete technique. Before coming to the mountain and sea realm, he had only created it up to the meridian opening stage. If cultivators followed this technique, then they would have to continue on the Tao of energy. Therefore, it couldn't be considered a true Taoist magic. Later, he had created a new technique, but at that time, his cultivation base was insufficient. At the most, the technique had reached the heavenly passage stage and was unable to advance any further. Therefore, he hadn't been able to truly use it. Furthermore, the descent of good fortune Pauline's Weili had also cut it off. However, he could still create a new technique. It only took a single thought for him to create a new magical incantation that was many times more profound than the one he had created before. However, he still felt that it was lacking something, which meant that it must be flawed. But then again, having flaws was actually a good thing. That way, Zhizhuang Daoren wouldn't pay too much attention to it. Furthermore, he could always make up for the flaws in it in the future. With that thought in mind, he willed a huge rock to appear in front of him. As he watched, numerous runes began to appear on the surface of the rock. The rock trembled, then shattered into countless fragments that scattered throughout the heavens. As for whether or not Zhizhuang Daoren would use good fortune Pauline to sever this Taoist magic, he didn't think it was very likely. This was because he, the heavenly chariot Lord Busu, was trying to implement a new technique in his own territory. It didn't involve the other worlds, so there was no reason for anyone to interfere. Furthermore, if someone dared to do so, then he would incite the Weili in Busu's heavenly chariot lands, as well as the other good fortune lands, and call upon all of his fellow Taoists to fight back. In that case, the previous agreement would be completely overturned. It wasn't hard for Zhizhuang to predict that this would happen. He was a man who abided by the rules and wouldn't lose sight of the bigger picture because of a small mistake. Having done all of that, he continued to sit in the hall, paying attention to any changes that might occur in the desolation. However, it was at this point that he suddenly sensed something and couldn't help but smile. Not long after, Zhang Chan entered the hall from outside. He was very happy as he bowed and said, "Greetings, old master. When I heard old master's call, I immediately came over." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "You go to Zihong's place for a while. Tell him that I know what he's up to. Tell him to be at ease and act boldly. There's no need to worry too much. Once you're there, you can stay by his side and work for him." With that, Zhang Chan excitedly made his way to the mountain and sea realm. In the Yao Yin clan, after Wei Zihong received the report from his subordinate, he took it very seriously. There was an urgent reason why the Eastern Wastelands was so popular with the demons and outsiders. Over the past thousands of years, the Taoist cultivators and the mystic cultivators had joined forces to hunt them down. Although the demons and outsiders had retreated into the depths of the wastelands, that was because the Tao had enough power to suppress them. If the outsiders knew that the Taoist magic had declined and that the cultivators had left the world, the Tao would no longer be able to suppress them, and they would most likely make a comeback. There was no need to talk about anything else. The Yao Yin clan was already showing signs of this. A few days ago, a few demonic cultivators from the lower sect had spread the news that the Taoist magic had been severed to the clan, and they had already been executed by the sect. He laughed coldly. These demonic cultivators had always been well-behaved, but now that the situation had changed, they immediately had their own ideas. He didn't know whether to call them stupid or ignorant. Did they really think that the Taoist magic had been severed, that the cultivators would have no more methods to deal with them? In his opinion, he had to ruthlessly suppress the idea that the demonic cultivators had just now. "It seems I can use the method I came up with earlier," he thought. Before stepping into the mortal shedding process, he had cultivated the myriad origins transformation art, which had been passed down to him by Patriarch Tai Hing. It was a technique that used the blood of a true dragon to cultivate. After he had severed his mortal shedding, his understanding of the technique deepened. If the blood of a true dragon could be used by humans, then the blood of a demon or devil could also be used, although the effects would be different. If he could create a technique that could steal the quintessence of the demons and devils and use it for himself, then not only would he be able to keep the outsiders in check, but he would also be able to benefit the Tao. Ever since the grand competition of the mountain and sea realm, the connection between the heavens and the myriad realms had grown more frequent. His vision was no longer focused on the mountain and sea realm, but rather on the Tao. Therefore, according to his plan, this technique would not only be used within the mountain and sea realm, but would also be used throughout the heavens and the myriad realms. At the same time, he would be able to spread the name of the Bright Nether bloodline and even the Yao Yin clan. However, this was a very important matter, especially since there were so many outsiders in the myriad realms. It would be difficult for him to take care of all of them by himself. The best thing to do would be to find other members of his sect to study the technique together and then discuss it with the sect leaders of the various sections. While he was trying to figure out the technique, a disciple came to report that Zhang Chan was requesting an audience. Knowing that Zhang Chan wouldn't be fine, he immediately said, "Invite him in." As soon as Zhang Chan entered, he clasped his hands and said, "Greetings, elder brother Wei." Wei Zihong returned the greeting with a smile. "Aren't you practicing cultivation on the heavenly star? I've heard that you're quite free and unfettered. What brings you to my place?" Zhang Chan said, I'm here on orders from my master to deliver a message. Wei Zihong's expression immediately turned serious. What message does master have for me? Zhang Chan said, Master says that if you have something you need to do, you can do it boldly. There's no need to have any misgivings. I'll stay here to help you, elder brother. Wei Zihong's spirits rose. So this was all within master's expectations. With master's protection, I can do as I please. In the southernmost part of the eastern wastelands, in the sea-sinking mountains, more than 10 large clans lived here, led by the Gao, Qing, and He clans. There were roughly 1 million of them, which was quite a large population in such a remote area. These people were not natives of the Eastern Baron. Their ancestors were people from the 9 cities of the Qinsong school. However, they were chased out because they made a mistake. Back then, there were not just 1 or 2 people who were chased out, but several clans. After this generation was chased out, because they could not stay near the northern cold abyss, nor could they join any mountain sea sect, they chose to migrate to the Eastern Baron. They knew some breathing techniques, and exchanged their savings for cultivation techniques from some small sections. For thousands of years, there would occasionally be 1 or 2 grand cultivators, and they could be considered to have gained a foothold in the Southern Baron. However, as their cultivation techniques were cut off, these large clans began to feel uneasy. The seaside was not like the inland of the Eastern Baron. There were all kinds of demonic fishes and demonic birds. They could still fight against this generation of people who were proficient in cultivation techniques, but what about the next generation? Wouldn't they only be food for the demons? Just as the upper echelons of the various clans were worried, the fishermen fished out some broken stones from the sea. They looked like they had fallen from a cliff somewhere, but they were covered with strange characters. The bow of the boat felt that they were extraordinary, so it was brought back to the clan. After all, the ancestors of the various clans were from the 9 cities, so they were also knowledgeable. At a glance, they recognized that it was an erosion rune. They suspected that it was related to the great sects of the 9 continents, so they ordered people to fish again. After half a year, they fished out hundreds of fragments, and finally put them together to form a stone tablet that was about 10 feet tall. What was strange was that after this object was put together, it would repair the damage on its own, and finally become one. The upper echelons of the various clans believed that this object was extraordinary, and they even looked for people who understood erosion runes to decipher it. However, there was no result. Over time, they lost interest in it and no longer paid attention to it. For more than 10 years, there was no movement from this object, and it was gradually forgotten. Until one day, a group of children went to play behind the mountain. One of them, surnamed Gao, lost his way and was separated from the others. Unknowingly, he walked in front of a cave. At this time, it happened to be sunrise. He saw light coming out of the cave, and out of curiosity, he walked in. Chapter 2143. The children who lived near the sea-sink mountain were all very bold. Their ancestors were citizens of the 9 cities, and they had been bathing in the spiritual chi of heaven and earth for nearly 10,000 years. They practiced the breathing method and were no longer ordinary people. Even a 5 or 6-year-old child dared to fight with a bear or a tiger in the mountains. Child Gao followed the light and walked in. The cave entrance was relatively wide, and it was filled with ointment for repelling beasts and insects. On his right was a passageway with a very flat ground. He walked along it for about 30 steps before he saw a cave hall. There was a pool in the corner, and there was nothing else besides a large stone tablet in the middle. The light came from the stone tablet. Although it illuminated the cave walls in a snow-white color, it was not dazzling to the eyes. Child Gao saw that the inscriptions were sometimes dim and sometimes bright, and there was a certain pattern. Curious, he went closer to take a look. Although he was illiterate and didn't understand the inscriptions, for some reason he could understand the content of the inscriptions. Moreover, he only needed to read it once to memorize it. Because he had been influenced for a long time, he could feel that this was a breathing technique and subconsciously began to practice it. When he woke up again, he saw light shining in from the hole above the pool. It turned out that a night had passed unknowingly, but he felt that only a short moment had passed. He jumped up from the ground and jumped a few more times. He found that his body was lighter than before, and his 5 senses were more sensitive. He left the cave and the sky was bright. This time he quickly found the way. After leaving the mountain, he happened to meet the Gao clan members who had come looking for him and were brought home. The Gao clan couple, who had been looking elsewhere, hurried back. They had also entered the mountain last night, but because they were only ordinary clan members, they did not know that there was a cave in the back of the mountain where the stone tablets were stored. They had been worried for the whole night. Now that their son had returned safe and sound, and was as lively as ever, they were relieved. They grabbed their son's ear and asked him about what had happened last night. Child Gao did not hide anything and excitedly told them about his experience last night. As soon as the Gao clan couple heard it, they immediately knew that it was a cultivation method. They became very nervous. In the past, there had been cultivators who had carelessly cultivated their qi. They hurriedly checked and found that their son was not only fine, but had even cultivated inner qi. They couldn't help but look at each other. Immediately, the two of them realized that this was not a small matter. Because the path of cultivation had been severed, it was no longer of much use for the children in the clan to practice the breathing technique. They did not expect that their son would have such a miraculous encounter. They immediately became uneasy and repeatedly told their son not to tell anyone about this. Then they hid in the house to discuss. They were very hesitant. They didn't know if they should report this matter to the clan. After deliberating for a long time, they decided to report it. His son might not be able to tell anything at the moment, but as time passes, this matter would definitely not be concealed from the clan's highly skilled elders. Moreover, it was hard to say whether there were still people who could understand the words written on it. If someone else found out and reported it, not only would they not have done anything, but they would also be guilty of concealing it. It was better to tell the clan earlier and as soon as possible. Otherwise, the clan would find fault with them in the future. Thus, they looked for the leader of the Gao clan. This clan leader was very shrewd. He asked them not to disclose this matter. That night, he personally went to the residence of the Gao clan couple and called Child Gao over to check on him. After confirming that this matter was true, he was surprised to find that the child could teach the breathing technique that he had learned orally to others. The leader of the Gao clan gave it a try and found that this method was indeed useful. At the same time, he could see that this was actually not the breathing technique that he had originally understood. The breathing technique was actually just a guide. It allowed one's own strength to be in harmony with one's own. Only then did it activate the inner qi. It did not use any spiritual opportunity, so he couldn't help but click his tongue in wonder. If this method was unique to the Gao clan, then perhaps, thinking of this, he shook his head. It was better to inform the other clan leaders about this matter as soon as possible. Although this method could be practiced, it was hard to say how high the upper limit was. Even if it could be practiced to a profound realm, it would at least be hundreds or thousands of years later. Now the situation outside was not optimistic. The countries in the south of the East Wilderness had fewer Taoist cultivators, and there was no successor for the mystic cultivators. It could be said that it was a mess, and now they could not even protect themselves. In the past, when Si Qinshan was in danger, they could still send people to help them. Now, it was impossible to do such a thing. Now, the demons and even the foreign species tribes were also getting restless. To survive in the chaotic world after the Taoist techniques were cut off, they could not rely on the strength of one person or one clan, but needed the strength of all clans. It was not a good choice to keep it to oneself. After he made up his mind, he immediately looked for the other clan leaders and told them about this matter. When the clan leaders heard about this, they were very surprised. They had thought that the stone steel was useless, but they had not expected it to actually have a method recorded on it. They first ordered people to keep a close watch on the stone steel. Then they found the child surnamed Gao and asked him about the cultivation method. After confirming it, they rewarded him with some things, then ordered people to take him away. They also sent a lot of people to keep him safe. The He clan leader said excitedly, "Before the sects of the 9 continents came to the mountain and sea realm, there had never been any eroded inscriptions. Later on, some were passed down, but few were proficient in them. This item must have come from the sects of the 9 continents. Perhaps it was some almighty being who pointed out a way for the people after the Taoist techniques were cut off. The Qing clan leader agreed. That's right. The sects of the 9 continents have the protection of Yuan Zun. How could Yuan Zun allow the Taoist techniques of the world to fall into oblivion? Since this opportunity has come to us, we should make good use of it. The Gao clan leader said calmly, "We don't care about how amazing this technique is. We just want to be able to protect ourselves in the future chaos." The other clan leaders nodded in agreement. They didn't dare to think about things that were too high and too far. As long as they could ensure the continuation of their clans and prevent their descendants from living in chaos, that was enough. After the clan leaders parted ways, they arranged for their clan disciples to practice the technique. They also arranged for each of them to observe the stone stele to see if they could obtain the same fate as the Gao clan child. They were pleasantly surprised. Over a dozen people were able to see some things from the stone stele, and most of them were children who weren't even 10 years old. After they began to practice the technique, the children who could see the contents of the stone stele progressed the fastest. First of all, they were the most compatible with the method recorded on the stone stele. Second, they were still children, so being able to explain some of the details of their cultivation was already good enough. But the deeper things involved the mind and heart, and were not so easy to express. Therefore, it was up to them to comprehend it on their own. After some discussion, the clan elders arranged for the children to stay in one place, both to protect them and to make it easier for them to communicate with each other. As of this moment, it wasn't just the sea-sink mountains that were doing this. Living beings in various remote locations throughout the mountain and sea realm were picking up similar rubble. There were not just Taoist settlements, but also demonic tribes. However, the outsiders and demons who picked up the rubble were unable to see anything special about it. Therefore, they didn't take it seriously. In fact, almost all of the living were able to gain enlightenment of a cultivation technique from it. Outside of the mountain and sea realm, there were quite a few people who had picked up rubble. Among them were many Taoist sects, and they quickly realized how valuable it was. After their Taoist magics had been cut off, they had been searching for a way out. Now that they had found the incantation, it was as if they had found a life-saving straw. However, compared to the bushwood heaven, this was like a drop of water entering the ocean. It didn't cause much of a stir. Zhang Yan could sense that there were quite a few people in Vast Expanse Palace who had begun to cultivate the incantation and couldn't help but nod. However, there were still some flaws in the incantation, and it couldn't lead to a true great Tao. Therefore, the only reason he was spreading it out was to plant a seed and not give Ji Zhuang too much of a head start. In the future, when he was able to repair the flaw, and when the time was right, he would pass on the complete incantation. However, because the Taoist magic hadn't fallen into the hands of the great sects, most of the people who had found the incantation didn't care about it. They didn't have any desire to pursue a great Tao. As long as they had the power to protect themselves, that was enough. On the other side, after obtaining Zhang Yan's support, Wei Zihong first went to find eldest senior sister Lu Yenyi, and then found Tian Kuan, Jiang Zheng, Yuan Jianqing, and the others who had severed their mortal bodies, and invited them to deduce the blood-severing technique together. After Lu Yenyi and the others learned of their master's attitude from Zhang Chan, they also took this matter seriously. They used their divine will to evolve the incantation and tried to fill in the gaps. They also used some of the strength path techniques that their master had passed down not long ago as a reference. Just now, they gradually perfected the incantation. Lu Yenyi even made a trip to the Kuan residence for this, and found quite a few loopholes there. After filling in the gaps, she brought the incantation out just now. When Wei Zihong saw the completed incantation, he was also delighted. He said to his fellow disciples, "This incantation will be implemented in our sect first. If it's useful, we can discuss with the sect masters about implementing it." On the same day, he sent this incantation to the new disciples to cultivate. After several months, he was quite satisfied with the results. A few of the chosen disciples originally only knew some breathing techniques, and they didn't have much talent. However, after using this incantation, they were able to compete with demons of the same level. This incantation used a magic bead that was extremely easy to refine as a vessel. The power of the demon's blood essence was seized, refined into the bead, and then used for one's own use. This incantation was divided into two parts, the inner and outer method. The inner method used medicine as a supplement to refine the demon's blood essence and boost one's strength and spirit. After a long time, one could use the outer method to borrow the magic bead to control the strange power of the bloodline. Furthermore, as long as one obtained a magic bead, they could use another ability. However, the most important thing to pay attention to here was that they couldn't be too hasty. They had to do their best to prevent the demon's blood essence from fusing with the human body. Instead, they had to use it as clothing. They could wear it at any time, and they could exchange it for another set of clothing at any time. If this incantation could be accepted by the various worlds, then future generations could take the initiative to exterminate demons, and they wouldn't have to completely rely on their ancestors. Chapter 2144. While Zhang Yan was deducing Dao techniques, he was also thinking about how to fight against Creation Pauline. Initially, he was thinking about whether he should look for the sword-bearing Taoist to ask about it. However, as soon as the thought arose, he sensed that it would not yield any results, so he gave up on the idea. From what he sensed from Creation Pauline, he knew that this item had scattered after the creation essence was broken, and there was more than one. Logically speaking, there should still be more in the silence, but how to find it was a problem. He looked at the source of the spiritual opportunity. Previously, when he went closer to take a look, he saw the shadow of a lotus there. If he boldly speculated, could the thing hidden there be a Creation Pauline? However, it was obvious that whether it was as he guessed, there should be someone or a consciousness behind it. Ji Zhuang did not go forward to snatch it. He did not know if it was because he was not confident, or was he waiting for the right time, or was he avoiding something. This item was most likely related to the Vedanta who had not returned, and it was obvious that it was there. Ji Zhuang was also staring at it, so it was difficult to start from this aspect. He changed his mind and entered the spirit. He stretched out his hand, and the lotus petal floated out. Under the premise that there were no definite clues, he could only settle for the next best thing. He could feel that the Creation Pauline in Ji Zhuang's hands was not complete, and there should be a part that was scattered outside. With his current senses that were far stronger than before, he might be able to find it. He changed his mind. Perhaps Ji Zhuang gave him this item in hopes that he would search for it and then try to snatch it back. As he had Pauline, it was obvious that he had a higher chance of success. However, this was not a problem. The reason why he did not directly clash with him was that things had not reached that stage yet. If there was something that he had to fight for, he would not give in even a little bit. Once he made up his mind, he began to pursue, and very quickly, his consciousness fell into the silence. At this moment, the doppelganger that he left outside felt that there was a trace of abnormality in Bu Shutian's appearance, and immediately turned its gaze in that direction. The White Furnace realm originally did not have any spirit vigor. It was the most ordinary world, so the living beings did not show any special characteristics. These living beings undoubtedly occupied the mainstream position. However, with the rise of inspiration, a series of strange things happened. Monsters began to appear in the wild. However, this was not a long time ago. Regardless of whether it was a monster or a different kind, it would take a long time for them to transform from an ordinary monster to possessing special powers. Currently, only a few monsters were slightly more powerful, but they did not have the ability to threaten the survival of the people. At the border of the E-Kingdom, in an uninhabited wilderness, a group of bandits were excavating the collapsed palace of the previous dynasty, hoping to find some gold and silver utensils. At this time, a burly man with a sturdy physique struck down with his hoe, and a dull sound was heard. The surrounding people all stopped what they were doing, knowing that they had dug up something, and immediately gathered around. There was a fiery look in someone's eyes, and he could not wait to urge, "Quick, quick, dig it up and see what it is." A rather prestigious-looking old man glared at him, and said unhappily, "What's the hurry? Can the meat in the pot run away?" He then said to the burly man, "Big guy, be careful, don't damage it. Forget it, your Uncle Chi will do it." The old man led his men, and slowly cleared it out. It was a thick leather box. The leather was not known what it was made of, but not only was it thick and tough, it did not rot even after being buried for so many years. However, there was a flashy golden chain on it. The old man stretched out his hand and pulled it off, and threw it to the people beside him. He walked a few steps away, and bowed to the sky. He mumbled something, and someone handed over an urn. He stretched his hand into the urn to wash it, and carefully wiped it with a clean cloth. Only then did he carefully open the leather box, and after a while he slowly lifted it up. However, what was inside was disappointing. It looked like a statue of a god, with a body but no head, and 4 limbs that looked like hands and claws. The clothes on its body looked like clothes and skin, and also like fur scales. Beside it, there was a cloth that could not be torn, and on it, there were many drawings of prostrating in worship. In the past, they had seen many similar things, and they were all used by the harem to curse and kill the people in the palace. It was said that the collapse of the previous dynasty was related to this, but after so many years, they had never seen anything strange. After discovering that it was not anything good, the crowd cursed a few times, and then dispersed. That night, the old man returned to the tent to rest, but the scene of the worship on the cloth lingered in his mind. For some reason, he took out the strange god statue, and tried to worship it according to the movements. Although it looked very simple, it was abnormally exhausting. After doing it once, he was abnormally tired, and finally fell asleep. When he woke up the next day, he felt that he was 100 times more energetic, and his originally frost-stained temples had actually recovered their black luster, and even the wrinkles on his face had disappeared. Moreover, his thoughts were clearer and more agile than usual. He immediately knew that the god statue and the roll of cloth were definitely treasures. He immediately returned to his hometown to cultivate, but it was unknown whether it was because his cultivation went awry, or because his nature was revealed, but he became more and more ruthless. After a year, he used this method to grasp powers that ordinary people did not have, such as moving objects in the air, hiding himself, and making hundreds of sounds from his mouth. He was as strong as steel, impervious to water and fire, and had extraordinary strength. When he was young, he used to be a mountain bandit, but because of his old age and weak body, he made a living by robbing. Now that he had recovered his strength, he returned to his old profession. In the next few years, he committed many shocking crimes, and because he found that the government officials and soldiers could not do anything to him, he gradually became bolder, and later on he even unscrupulously robbed the officials' silver, which eventually led to the soldiers' conscription. However, he relied on his abilities to roam the continents, and later attracted a group of disciples, and taught them the method of worshipping the god statue. If this continued, there was really no one who could control him. However, when he was preparing to attack the prefecture, there was a sudden heavy rain on the road, and then there was a flash flood. Not only did his disciples scatter, but he was also covered by the mountain rocks and mud, unable to come out. 10 days later, he was discovered by a local old farmer, but he was not dead yet. He was locked up by the prefectural officials, and his belongings were sent to the imperial court. Because he was impervious to weapons and did not fear water or fire, he was finally trapped and killed, and the god statue and the roll of cloth were obtained by the king of each country. However, the matter did not end there. After his death, his disciples were scattered all over the place. These people also learned the art of worship and carved their own statues based on their memories. However, they discovered that they could also obtain power by doing so. In the next 20 years or so, this art spread far and wide, causing endless unrest in the country. At the same time, the government of the country also received instructions from the imperial court to fight against bandits. Gradually, the conflict between the two sides broke away from the level of mortals, and grew more intense. When Zhang Yan saw this, he looked away. Without a doubt, this was the ritual of worshipping that Zhizhuang Daoren had taught him, except that it was now in Busha heaven. He sent his senses out again, and found that it wasn't just this one place. There were several other heavens that had similar Taoist magics. Only the Kunshi continent and the mountain and sea realm had no such signs. It was most likely not a deliberate attempt to avoid them, but rather, one of them was in the heart of Busha heaven, where spiritual energy flourished, and there were many strange powers present. The other was under the protection of the Weili. Therefore, the Taoist magics automatically sought refuge in the weaker areas. Was this Zhizhuang Doran's test? He thought about it for a moment. Perhaps it was because he had repeatedly observed the Taoist magics, and now he was trying to see if he had discovered anything. If he acted, then it would undoubtedly confirm his suspicions. If he didn't act, then he could spread the Taoist magics in Busha Heaven and wouldn't lose anything. He thought about it for a moment, then decided to let it be. The fact that this person could use a Taoist magics to enter Busha Heaven meant that he had borrowed the power of good fortune Pauline. Even if he acted now to erase the traces, if he wanted to, he could use other methods. He wouldn't be able to stop him and would instead expose the fact that he already knew what the person was up to. It was better to leave it for now. He could observe the person's every move at any time, and if it exceeded a certain limit, then he could deal with it. Furthermore, Zhizhuang didn't have the ability to observe what was going on inside Busha Heaven. At most, he could sense whether or not the Taoist magics he had cast into the Taoist magics had disappeared, so it wasn't a big problem. It had to be known that in Busha Heaven, after the original Taoist magics were severed, more than one type of Taoist magics had appeared. When cultivated to a high level, the effects were not much different. He wanted to see how people would choose when faced with so many Taoist magics. After thinking about it, he didn't think about it anymore, but turned his head to look. After so many years, he was finally getting closer to the last Taoist magics he could sense. Long before the 4 great sects were founded, the 9 continents had already been filled with sects, and there had been many cultivators who had severed their mortal bodies. However, at that time, the 9 continents was still rich in spiritual vigor, so even if these people had the ability to cross the sky, most of them didn't think of leaving this place and looking for another world. After all, it was not easy to find the same world, and if they were not careful, they might get lost in the void primordial sea. However, as the spiritual vigor gradually weakened, the sects in the West continent fought each other, and some people were defeated and killed in the battle, while some chose to fly away. Later on, there were a few cultivators who didn't belong to the 4 great sects who had ascended to the 9 continents. However, when he checked with the Taishang Weili, he didn't find the whereabouts of the cultivators who had ascended to the 9 continents. Therefore, he suspected that this generation had ascended to the 9 continents. Maybe it was in one of the Taoist magics, and the possibility of it being in this place was very high. It was just that he didn't know who created this Taoist magics, and whether it was the earliest cultivators or those who ascended later, they didn't have the summoning talisman, but they could all go to this place. This was undoubtedly the work of a mighty person, and it was impossible to do this without reaching the level of deity refinement. There must be something special about a place like the 9 continents that attracted the attention of so many mighty people. However, his cultivation had not reached the realm of great virtue, so he couldn't see the real intention of those few people, and he didn't know if he could find something useful from this Taoist magics. He called in his heart, and after a long time, a gust of chilly wind drifted into the hall, and a vague figure appeared. He bowed to the seat and said, "Peng Xiang pays his respects to Taishang." Chapter 2145. Zhang Yan looked at Peng Xiang. Due to the restriction of the contract, he could no longer corrupt cultivators. Instead, he could only rely on breathing spiritual vigor to survive. Therefore, he looked more and more like a cultivator now. Although the heavenly demon was also fickle and could transform into the appearance that people wanted to see, it was not difficult for him to see the truth. He knew that it was not an imitation, but the essence had indeed changed. He changed his mind and a jade talisman appeared out of thin air and landed in front of him. He said, "This thing can send you to a place. What to do and how to get there, when the time comes, you will know what to do." Peng Xiang took the jade talisman and said, "I respectfully accept the decree." He bowed again and turned into a cold wind. After Peng Xiang returned, he immersed himself in the sea of turbid air, accumulating his strength and silently waiting. Suddenly, one day, the jade talisman suddenly flew out and transformed into a ray of spiritual light, which opened up in front of him. He knew that the time had come, so he turned invisible and floated in like a gust of cold wind. At this moment, Zhang Yan also sensed that his senses were being obstructed by a force. This was a completely unfamiliar mighty force, which meant that it wasn't any one of the four patriarchs who had created this chaos heaven, but a completely unknown almighty being. This person's attitude towards the outside world was not very clear, so it was not safe to send anyone. Peng Xiang as a restricted Genin demon was very suitable. Even if he was killed, he could still know the specific situation inside. However, in order not to expel the strange force, he would not leave this world outside. Therefore, if there were signs of separation in this world and Peng Xiang had not come out by then, he would personally take action and fix this place. Peng Xiang entered the world and found himself standing on a barren planet. Surrounding him was a boundless void. This place gave him a feeling of lifelessness. Originally, when the spiritual vigor of the various realms flourished, this place should have been affected, but there were no signs of such. Following his will, he traveled across the entire Earth star in an instant. However, there was nothing here. It was barren, not even ravines or star craters. This meant that there had never been any major changes here. He extended his senses, and from time to time he would see one or two places that were similar to the one he was standing on. They were also barren, and not a single person could be seen. Not a single one of them emitted light or heat, so there were no vast galaxies that could be seen in the other world. There was only silence. If a cultivator came here, he might not like such a place. But as a devil, he saw this place as an ordinary place. The only difference was that there was no turbid chi or spiritual opportunity here. The Genin demon, on the premise that there were no living creatures, relied on the impure spirituality to survive. As long as the spirituality was not extinguished, it would not die. However, there was not a single thing that could support its survival here. It could only rely on its own strength to survive. Fortunately, he had made preparations before coming out. As long as he didn't squander his energy, he would be able to last for a long time. At this moment he took out a box. As soon as he opened it, there seemed to be a whistling sound. Countless devils surged out like a flood and scattered in all directions. In such a desolate void, the loss of his magic power was not worth the gain. These devils could replace him to look around. He traveled in the boundless void. The scenery around him was the same, and it was very boring. However, not to mention that he was a Genin demon, any cultivator who had cultivated to this level would not be disturbed by this. After an unknown period of time, he suddenly felt a response from one of the devils. It was another Earth star. On the surface, this Earth star looked no different from the one he saw before. However, he could clearly sense that this Earth star was one size smaller than the other Earth stars. Among the many similar things, there was one that was especially different. Naturally, it was eye-catching. With a turn of his mind, he had already landed on that devil and instantly replaced it. At this moment, he had already appeared on that unique Earth star. He first inspected it and saw that there were many traces of cultivators staying here. Moreover, there were more than one place. This was good news. It meant that there was not really nothing in the void. And the reason why this Earth star was small was that the person who came before had used his magic power to create many caves. Moreover, he also saw that the person who came before seemed to have tried to create earth, fire, wind, and water. It seemed that he wanted to change the entire Earth star into a place of spiritual beauty. However, it was obvious that he did not succeed in the end. However, to be able to do this, the person must have at least a mortal metamorphosis cultivation base. From the traces left behind, he deduced that the person who stayed here was actually only a cultivator from the beginning. This person should have stayed here for a relatively long period of time, at least 1,000 years. However, he did not know why he gave up later on. If a mortal metamorphosis cultivator died, he would return to the void and everything around him would also be devoured. However, from the looks of it now, this was not the case. This person should have encountered something and left this place in a hurry. Peng Xiang guessed that it was very likely that this person had also come from the outside world. Because everything around him was the same, he simply created a cave that suited him. Later on, he might have discovered something and abandoned it. However, it was worth investigating what this person had discovered. He carefully searched again and tried to recreate the past. Unfortunately, there was no trace of the owner of this place. Fortunately, when this person left, he did not deliberately conceal his tracks. Thus, he quickly determined the direction in which he escaped. Thus, he followed in that direction. Because he could not be sure if this person would change directions along the way, he constantly released devils along the way to avoid missing anything. Even so, he might not be able to pinpoint the whereabouts of this person. The void was infinite. Who knew where that person would go? As long as one of the clues was broken, there would be no way to reconnect them. Fortunately, his luck was not bad this time. Soon, he found traces left by that person on another Earth star. This time, he also found a celestial device used by cultivators to stop their avatars. It should have been deliberately left here by that person to prevent accidents when he discovered something. However, this thing was not used later on. From this point of view, it was good news. After a brief inspection, he was surprised to find that there was still a trace of divine will hidden in it, but it was already very weak. If others obtained this divine will, they might have to go through a lot of trouble to find the owner. However, as the Xian Yin Sky Demon, regardless of whether the other party was dead or alive, he only needed to use this divine will and he would be able to find the owner. With a turn of his body, he entered the strand of divine will and returned to the world. However, the surrounding scenery was unexpected. On both sides were tall walls that stood perfectly straight, and in the middle, there was a long passageway that led to who knows where. He looked up into the sky and saw dark clouds covering the sky. However, they were not moving like clouds, but rather thick and viscous. This place gave him the feeling of a cage. However, even if it were a cage, it wouldn't be able to trap him. Not to mention the fact that he still had many clones in the outside world. Even if all of them were destroyed, he would still have countless clones to replace them in the mountain and sea realm. His body flickered, and in the blink of an eye, he became incorporeal and flew along the passageway. After some time, the mountain wall seemed to move to the side, revealing a large open space. This was a place that was shaped like a valley, surrounded by high walls. Above them were densely packed caves, and in the middle were collapsed stone pillars and broken walls. Suddenly, his expression became serious. In the middle of the cave, he saw a handsome young Taoist sitting cross-legged. His eyebrows were high, his eyes like stars, and his face was handsome. Peng Xiang had originally planned to enter this person's mind to see what was going on. However, after some testing, he found that this person's mind, energy, and spirit were perfect, and there were no flaws that could be detected. He knew that this person wasn't someone to be trifled with. Since he wasn't sure if he was friend or foe, he didn't want to reveal himself. Instead, he decided to investigate the surrounding area. However, in the next moment, he sensed that something was off. His body was incorporeal, and if he didn't intentionally reveal himself, even a third-stage cultivator who could sever the past and future avatars wouldn't be able to detect him. However, this person was looking directly at him, waving his sleeve and pointing at him. Peng Xiang immediately felt a great sense of crisis. His opponent had clearly just pointed a finger and hadn't revealed any power at all. However, Peng Xiang felt as if he had no way to defend himself. If he didn't dodge, he would definitely die. Thinking about it, he prepared to flee to another gargoyle. In any case, he had already been here, so even if he left, he would be able to find his way back. However, as soon as he thought about it, he found that he was being held back by some sort of power and couldn't move an inch. Seeing that Peng Xiang didn't have any way to retaliate, the Taoist seemed to be a little disappointed. He retracted his hand and said, "Since you came uninvited, why are you still standing there? Why don't you come closer and have a chat?" Peng Xiang had met many experts before, but it was rare for him to be suppressed to the point where he couldn't even fight back. He revealed himself and walked in front of the Taoist, saying, "You stopped just now and called me a Taoist friend. Could it be that you can't see that I'm different?" The Taoist said indifferently, "What's the difference? Since you're here, you can't get out. No matter what your identity is, it's the same." Peng Xiang was silent for a moment, then he bowed and said, "I'm Peng Xiang, may I know your name?" The Taoist raised his eyebrows and returned the bow, saying, "I'm Shen Chong." Peng Xiang looked around and said, May I know where this place is, and why do you say that we can't get out? Shin Chong glanced at him and said, Where did you come from? Peng Xiang was about to answer, but the Taoist waved his hand. Forget it, this matter is not important. He pointed at the mountain walls. Go up there and you'll know. Peng Xiang's mind changed, and he instantly came to the front of a cave, only to find a Taoist statue inside. His face and clothes were all exquisite. Suddenly, he thought of a possibility and moved to another cave. As expected, he saw another statue. After looking at it one by one, his expression turned solemn. He turned into a cold wind and returned to his original position, saying, Taoist friend, could it be that these are? Shin Chong nodded and said, Yes, these are the cultivators who ascended to this place in the past. Now they've all become like this. Chapter 2146. Just now, Peng Xiang had some similar guesses about the origin of those statues. Now that Shin Chong had personally confirmed it, he could not help but think of more things. After a while, he returned to his senses and tried to ask, Why did these fellow Taoists become like this? Shen Chong said, Some of them reached the end of their lifespan, and because they could not leave this place, they did not return to the void. After a long time, they were restrained by the force of this place and turned into statues. Some of them, because there was no spiritual opportunity here, they knew that they would not be able to survive if they continued like this, so they simply let the force corrode them and willingly changed and consolidated, hoping that there would be a chance for them to escape in the future. Peng Xiang could not help but ask, Then why did you not become like this? He had never heard of Shun Chang's name before. Ever since he became Zhang Yan's disciple, although he knew that the sects of the mountain and sea realm had migrated from the 9 continents, he would instinctively avoid anything related to the 9 continents. He did not dare to investigate too much, for fear of inadvertently offending some taboo. However, he could feel that Shin Chong was not someone who had just arrived. He should have been here for a very long time. Then why did everyone become like this? But he was fine. Shen Chong said matter-of-factly, That is because I am not willing to admit defeat. Peng Xiang was puzzled. Not willing to admit defeat? At this moment, Shen Chong raised his head, looked around and said, These people are mediocre and have all become solid statues. Now, the only person who can be my opponent is this strong prison. I want to see how long it can hold me. In the end, will I be turned into a statue here, or will I break the prison and get out? At this moment, Peng Xiang could clearly feel the high fighting spirit of this person. Although he was a Gen-in demon, he had come into contact with many cultivators. He also knew how difficult it was to have such a strong will under such adversity. He nodded and said, At this point, I understand that many people were not defeated by external enemies, but fell on the lonely path. The loneliness here did not refer to living alone, nor did it refer to the extreme loneliness, but the road ahead was vague, and one could not see the great way. Just like right now, the cultivators who entered could only be trapped here, with no hope of reaching the higher realms. There was no way out and everything was the same. Just how despairing was this? Shen Chong raised his eyebrows and said, Even if I enter the darkness, my heart will not waver. As long as my spirit remains, I can ask about the Taishu. What is there to fear about mere loneliness? Peng Xiang could tell that what he said was indeed what he believed in his heart. He was also thinking that if this person hadn't fallen here back then and had fallen outside, then he would definitely be one of the people who stirred up the worlds. He said, I have something to ask you. This place is completely empty, there's no spiritual vigor at all. Since many of our fellow Taoists have turned into solid statues, how did you survive? Shen Chong smiled for the first time when he heard this. This is where the fun lies. Peng Xiang said, What do you mean? Shen Chong said, In the past, many of our fellow Taoists came here. Everyone who came would have some purple clear spiritual vigor, and I would take out all the purple clear spiritual vigor to gamble with them. If they win me, then all the spiritual vigor I have on me will belong to them. If they lose, then I will take everything they have. Peng Xiang looked around. There were quite a number of caves. Assuming that there was a fellow Taoist in every cave, he looked at Shin Chong again. The person in front of him was still sitting there, which meant that this person had never been defeated even once. This deduction was very shocking. One must know that there might not only be one enemy. Some of the cultivators might not be strong, but they have unfathomable means. In such a desperate situation, they would usually explode with power that was stronger than before. Just by thinking about it, one would know how dangerous it was. It was no wonder that he could not fight back in front of this person just now. Shenchong said, "You don't have to think too much. I've only met half of the people here before. The rest had turned into statues before I came." Peng Xiang shook his head and said, "That's also very impressive. But what if the person who comes has no intention to gamble with you?" Shenchong said casually, "Then let him be. It's just that after a long time, unless he is willing to turn into a statue, he will eventually come to fight with me. Even if Purple Clear is exhausted, it's a pleasure to be able to fight with someone." It was such a simple sentence, but Peng Xiang felt some cruelty from it. Once the person who came used up his Purple Clear spiritual vigor, he would undoubtedly target the spiritual vigor in Shenchong's hands. That would be a battle with no way out. However, if it was him, he would divide the Purple Clear spiritual vigor into several parts for gambling. This way, he could test Shenchong's strength. If he felt that he could not defeat Shenchong, he could slowly think of countermeasures and fight with his life at the last moment. After understanding this, he also knew that as long as the rules and regulations in this world continued, Shenchong would have a way to survive. However, Peng Xiang thought that after he sent the news back, it would probably be a different scene. Maybe those who had not reached the end of their lifespan could be freed. He thought for a while and asked, "These fellow Taoists should have ascended from more than one realm." Shenchong said, "Indeed, there is more than one. As far as I know, there are more than 10. However, among them, only the people from the 9 continents are capable of fighting. As for those who came from other realms, all of them are incomparably weak and could not withstand a battle. Let's not talk about them." Peng Xiang thought that those people from the 9 continents might be acquainted with the Grand Elder, so he had to pay attention to them. He said, "May I know where the people from the 9 continents are?" Shenchong looked at him and said, "You came from the 9 continents?" Peng Xiang said, "No, I came from the mountain and sea realm. Because the sects in the 9 continents had exhausted their spiritual vigor, they joined forces to break through the realm and ascend to the mountain and sea realm. This place is rich in spiritual vigor and can accommodate Taoist cultivators who have achieved mortal body, so there is no need to look for other realms." Shenchong nodded and said, "The last person who came from the 9 continents was a fellow Taoist named Yuling. He seemed to be a sect leader and had some ability. He once said that the spiritual vigor of the 9 continents was almost exhausted, so he did not have the pure violet spiritual vigor. Now, he has also turned into a statue." He stretched out his hand and pointed in a certain direction. "Over there, the people from the 9 continents are all there." Peng Xiang looked in that direction. Although the person there had turned into a statue, his appearance was still there. However, at this moment, he felt that one of the statues seemed to be different from the others, so he could not help but take a second look. The statue looked like a middle-aged Taoist, tall and strong. What was different from the others was that there seemed to be some vitality flowing out from it. "This is," Shenchong said, "this person is Patriarch Taiheng. When I was in the 9 continents, I heard of his fame. When I first came here, he had already turned into a statue, leaving only a strand of his divine will. Apart from that, he also had a lot of pure violet spiritual vigor left to help those who came later. It is said that he cultivated the 3 Daos of human, demon, devil, and mysterious. He is really quite powerful. Even though he has turned into a statue, he still has a chance to live. If there is a chance in the future, he might be able to reincarnate and return." Peng Xiang could hear the sigh in his words, so he said, "Fellow Taoist, are you regretting that you could not fight him?" Shenchong shook his head and said, "I once entered his divine will and fought him. When I first came here, he could still beat me. Unfortunately, after he turned into a statue, his cultivation could no longer improve. Now, I can't say that he is a good opponent." Peng Xiang said, "Fellow Taoist, do you think that this person can reincarnate?" Shenchong said very casually, "Who knows?" To him, People who were no longer his opponent were no longer worthy of his attention. Seeing that Peng Xiang had already spoken to this point, he casually asked for the names of the others. Shen Chong did not know much about this, because there were still some cultivators from the western continent here, and they had ascended long before the sects came east. After Peng Xiang noted down some of the people he knew, he asked the most important question, "Fellow Taoist, you must have been here for a long time. Do you know who set this place up?" Shen Chong said, "This person has never appeared in front of us, so it is hard to know his background. However, there were quite a number of people who came here earlier and said that they had used the receiving talisman of their ancestors to come here. However, after seeing this place in the end, they found out that their ancestors were also trapped here. Moreover, these people came from different places, which shows how powerful the person behind them is." Peng Xiang said, "I don't know what his intention is to trap so many people here." Shen Chong said indifferently, "This person's realm of mana is above us. If your cultivation is not there, then there is no point in thinking too much. Why waste your effort?" Peng Xiang nodded. He also knew that the person behind him who could open up Chaos Heaven and bring many cultivators who had ascended here might be a Grand Supreme as well. Therefore, he didn't dare to talk too much and said, "I didn't come here to ascend. I came here under orders to investigate the details of this world. Since I've roughly found out about this place, I need to return and report on my mission." Shen Chong said, "I know you're the Xian Sky Demon. If you had a clone outside, you wouldn't have died just like that. However, due to the restraining force here, after you left, you wouldn't have died. However, because of the restrictive force here, after you leave, your clone will not know what you see and hear here." Peng Xiang said, "To be honest, the person who sent me here is a Grand Elder. With the help of the Grand Elder Weili, it will not be difficult for me to leave this place." Although Shen Chong had interacted with the cultivators of various worlds, he had never heard of the name Grand Elder. But after Peng Xiang said this, he suddenly knew what it was. At this moment, the land that seemed to have never changed before suddenly shook. Neither he nor Peng Xiang knew why, but they could faintly feel that after the title of Supreme Elder was spoken, it had naturally interfered with the original order of this place. Peng Xiang took out a golden talisman from the void and infused it with his will. In an instant, a spiritual light screen rose up, but at this moment, the surroundings shook again, and many statues in the cave shattered. He didn't know what happened, but he knew that he had to leave as soon as possible. Before he left, he turned to Shen Chong and said, "Fellow Taoist, why don't you leave with me?" Shen Chong did not appreciate it and said, "If you can leave, you can. I have already said that this cage is my opponent. If I do not win, I will not leave." Peng Xiang was only asking one more question. At this moment, he seemed to have a premonition that Shen Chong not leaving with him might be a good choice, so he did not say anything more. He bowed to Shen Chong and entered the spiritual light screen. Chapter 2147. Peng Xiang walked out of the spiritual light screen and sensed the abundant spiritual energy around him, confirming that he had returned to the mountain and sea realm. He suddenly realized that the tremor he had felt before returning was actually caused by the collision between the golden talisman and the restraining force. If he had come out a bit later, he might have been trapped there, but he hadn't thought of that at the time. He wasn't afraid of it but only felt respect for the Weili. He calmed himself down and summoned the golden talisman. His aura changed, and he followed the guidance of the golden talisman. The next moment, he landed in front of a large hall. He bowed to the Taoist boy in front of the door and said, "Please tell the Taoist that Peng Xiang has returned to report." The Taoist boy bowed to him and said, "The Patriarch knows that you have returned, so he ordered me to wait here. Please go in." Peng Xiang thanked him and walked into the hall. However, as he walked, he felt as if he had been relieved of some burden, but at the same time, he felt as if something was missing and he couldn't help but pause. He guessed that this might be because he had been affected by something in the muddy sky, and only when he arrived in front of the exalted Zhang Yan did he reveal his true self and leave. However, after thinking about it again, he felt that this couldn't have been deliberately targeted by the master of the muddy sky. It was very likely that he had been affected by it after going there, otherwise he might not have been able to return. As he pondered, he arrived in the hall. He walked to the bottom of the steps and bowed to the seat. Then he raised the golden talisman with both hands and said, "Peng Xiang greets the exalted. I have come to report." Zhang Yan nodded slightly. Normally, after Peng Xiang returned, he should have been able to see what had happened to him. However, the Lord of Muddy Skies seemed to be very cautious. After Peng Xiang returned to the mountain and sea realm, everything he had seen and known in the past had quickly faded away. Even he himself didn't notice it. Therefore, he could only see the gist of it. However, with the golden talisman and the Whaley here, as long as he wasn't expelled when he entered the realm, even if Peng Xiang had forgotten everything, he would still be able to see everything through the golden talisman. As soon as his gaze fell, the golden talisman turned and arrived in front of him. It quickly merged with his divine decree, and in an instant, he understood everything. Sure enough, the ascended cultivators of the 9 continents had fallen here. Not only were there figures like Yuling that he'd come into contact with in the past, there were also figures like Tai Heng and Shun Chong that he'd heard of a long time ago. It was no wonder that he'd never seen these people in the outside world. It was indeed a wise choice for Shun Chong not to follow him. Peng Xiang had only been in Chaos Sky for a short period of time, so he had not been affected much by the binding force there. However, he was different. He had been there for a long time, and if he forced himself out, it was very likely that he would be forcefully turned into a statue by that force. Although he might not know about this, he instinctively chose the most beneficial and most suitable method for himself. It was just that, in addition to the cultivators of the 9 continents, there was no one who ascended to immortality in Busushin's world. Even if they were trapped in the void primordial sea, they all had their own ending. There were many cultivators that had turned into statues, so not only were there Busu Heaven cultivators, but there were also other people who had come into being. But what was the intention of the Master of Chaos Sky doing this? Like the 4 patriarchs who had left their orthodoxy on the 9 continents, opened up Chaos Sky outside Busushin, and left behind fragments of the essence of good fortune or land of good fortune, perhaps they hoped that the younger generation could achieve the supreme method and help them return earlier, so they left behind one or several lineages of inheritance. But this was only a guess, because the price of the return of the great virtue was great. It seemed that the case of the devouring of everything was a precedent. Perhaps the patriarchs did not think so, but had other plans. But the style of the Master of Chaos Sky was very different from the 4. Not only did he not leave behind any sects, but he also gathered the cultivators who had ascended to break the world in one place. He thought about it again, and the purpose might be the same, but the means used were different. The Master of Muddy Sky was able to stop the rise of Spiritium and turn the entire Muddy Sky into a lifeless place. This meant that the Master of Muddy Sky had more power than the 4 patriarchs. If the Master of Muddy Sky used this to cause trouble in Bux's sky, it would be very troublesome. Therefore, he must expel the Master of Muddy Sky, even if he had to destroy the entire Muddy Sky. With this thought in mind, he mobilized his own magic power and Busushin Whaley, and invaded this Chaos Sky. Because this space was originally separated from Busushin, it had no resistance against this kind of invasion, and he easily broke through. After invading, he was not in a hurry to expel this power. Instead, he used this place as a springboard to peek outside. Judging from the chaotic heavens left behind by the founding masters of the 4 sects, all of them had good fortune fragments or lands of good fortune left behind, so it was very likely that there were such things behind this chaotic heavens. Soon, he found that this Chaos Sky had more than 10 gateways, most of which led to the present world that had long been destroyed. Only a few still existed, and they were all maintained by a fragment of fate behind them. There was no place of fate in them, but it could not be ruled out that the other party had covered it up. In the Chaos Sky, Shin Chong sat under the high wall, his eyes closed. He believed that there were no loopholes in the world. Even if it looked perfect on the surface, it was because his cultivation was not enough, and he did not find the loopholes, so he still needed to polish it from time to time. This was also seen by him as a way of fighting, but it was not a fight with the enemy, but a fight with himself. For thousands of years, he had been constantly perfecting his cultivation, but as his cultivation became more profound, he could feel that even if there was no end to this road, if he wanted to go up, he still seemed to be missing something. At this moment, he suddenly felt a burst of vibration between heaven and earth. He opened his eyes and said, "I think it's coming." After Peng Xiang successfully left this place, he had already guessed that either nothing would happen after coming down, or there would be a collision between the Grand Supreme behind Peng Xiang and the Master of Chaos Sky. The violent turbulence now clearly showed that what he had guessed had already happened. He also keenly discovered that the binding force around him was actually dissipating greatly, and many statues also began to collapse and shatter because of this. He did not pay much attention to it, because most of these shattered statues were people who had already reached the end of their lifespans. If there was still vitality left in them, they naturally would not be destroyed so easily. Moreover, these people did not ask him to protect them before they turned into elephant forms, so he naturally would not do anything unnecessary. At this moment, he seemed to have discovered something, and with a thought, he looked up for a moment. After a while, there seemed to be a glass halo flashing on his body, and countless fine talisman fragments surrounded his body. After a moment of sensing, he climbed to an extremely high place, and immediately saw the two unreachable Weili. But in just an instant, all of this suddenly shattered, and his consciousness returned to its original place. He found that in this trance, his divine will was almost exhausted, but he was able to see the upper realm Weili. Even if he did not understand it, it was still very worth it. Logically speaking, even if he cut off his past and future body in a confrontation of that level, he would not be able to sense it. However, his body had been infected by the binding force for a long time, and instead, he could use this force to see a trace of change. He raised his hand, and the layer of binding force on his body completely disappeared. This undoubtedly showed that the Grand Supreme mentioned by Peng Xiang was even more tyrannical, or else it would not have been like this. From the looks of it, after the collision, the owner of this place was very likely to be the defeated party, and this place was very likely to cease to exist. If that was the case, there was no need for him to continue staying here. When this world was broken, he would escape from this place. The only regret was that the outcome of this battle was ultimately not determined. At this moment, he saw the dark clouds in the sky that seemed to have never changed before split open, and a light beam shone down. Then, an object that looked like jade or stone floated down and stopped in front of him. He took a look and somehow understood what it was. He said thoughtfully, "An object that leads to the upper realm?" This object should have been here for a long time, but now that the two Weili had collided, the owner of this realm knew that he could no longer withstand it, so he revealed this object in advance and handed it over to him to deal with. Shen Chong shook his head. If he had obtained this object after winning this battle, then he could have accepted it with a clear conscience, and would not have cared about anything else. However, it was revealed by him, so he would not take it at all. To win was to take it, to win was to win, to not be greedy, not to be reckless, and not to lose. This could be considered the Tao in his heart. If he was greedy and destroyed it, then he would no longer be himself, and it would be impossible for him to improve his Tao in the future. Therefore, although this object was good, it was meaningless to him, so he did not look at it at all. At this moment, he just happened to feel a trace of a gap appearing between heaven and earth, and he leaped up without hesitation. A dense and clear light flashed on his body, and he instantly rushed out of this hazy place. As the light faded, he disappeared without a trace. At this moment, Zhang Yan suddenly felt that the Weili in the chaotic sky was disappearing rapidly. There was no doubt that it was withdrawing on its own initiative. He thought for a while. Since it was willing to withdraw on its own initiative, then there was no need for him to pursue it. After all, it was very likely that the other party was also a great virtue, and it might have some tricks up its sleeves. Therefore, he did not continue to expel it, but let it go. At the same time, as long as the statues that were originally sunk in the dangerous land still had vitality, regardless of whether they were people who had ascended from the 9 continents or not, they were all brought out by him and placed in a randomly opened world. He looked at the statues. These people who were voluntarily bound, as long as there was an obsession in their hearts, and the desire to seek Tao had not been extinguished, then it was still possible for them to come back. Otherwise, they could only continue to exist as statues. Although it was not difficult for him to resolve it with the Whaley, if he did so, the barrier of Tao karma would always be with them. Even if they came back, they would never be able to improve again. Therefore, under the situation where these people did not take the initiative to ask for help, he would not make a choice for them. Now that no one had transmitted such thoughts, it undoubtedly meant that everyone here hoped to use their own strength to get rid of the shackles, and no one was willing to submit to live. This was not very surprising. Those who needed to break through the sky and ascend to seek Tao meant that either the spiritual vigor of heaven and earth was weak, or there was no technique to ascend to the upper realm. Those who could go to the unpredictable upper realm for the sake of seeking Tao were not simple people. At least they had passed the test on the path of Tao heart. His gaze fell on the chaotic sky again, and he also saw the mysterious stone. However, it was only an image. The owner of the Whaley had hidden it elsewhere, and it could not be obtained by those who were not fated to be able to obtain it. However, if he forcefully searched for it, there might be a result in the end. However, this item was not worth him making a big fuss over, so he did not care about it anymore after taking a look. Chapter 2148. Zhang Yan also sensed that Shen Chong had escaped to a certain world. That world wasn't ordinary, and there was at least a good fortune fragment behind it. Not only that, but the chaotic sky master's Whaley had also retreated in that direction, and that world faded from his senses. However, there was no need to chase after it. This place might be related to the arrangements of that great benefactor. As long as the Whaley didn't come to obstruct Bu Shutian, there was no need to care. At this moment, he moved his mind and retrieved the few good fortune fragments he had sensed. After waiting for a short while, the mighty force finally retreated completely, and only an empty sky was left. With such great power, the heaven and earth that were originally stagnant suddenly became alive. Everything began to change, and the spiritual vigor that had been suppressed also began to flourish. Even if he abandoned it, there would naturally be clear turbid chi evolving into living beings. However, he was wondering if he should directly destroy this chaotic sky to eliminate all the great benefactor's arrangements. However, after some calculations, he found that there were other implications, and the final result was beneficial to him. Seeing this, he simply gave up on this idea. At this moment, he sensed that the chaotic sky that was originally drifting outside belonged to Bu Shutian. Now that they had all returned, he felt that the Whaley had become much smoother. He still didn't know if there were still chaotic skies outside. If they were concealed by some special method, he wouldn't be able to find them. However, as he gradually removed the strange force, these chaotic skies would eventually be exposed, so he wasn't in a hurry. Although the concealed chaotic skies were difficult to find, it was also difficult for it to be related to Bu Shutian's other chaotic skies. It could be considered a lone existence, and if there were any unusual movements, he would immediately discover it. The degree of threat was actually the lowest. After making up his mind, he sent out a talisman, ordering Dandy Guang and the others to go to the chaotic sky that he had casually opened up. They were responsible for guarding the statues that had been moved out. After doing this, he went into meditation. Less than 100 days after the chaotic sky unity, Dandy Guang and the others were meditating as usual. Suddenly, they felt a very strong fluctuation of energy, and they couldn't help but open their eyes. Dandy Guang said to the other 5, "You wait here, I'll go take a look." He got up and teleported to the cave where the statues were placed. Then, he turned around and arrived in front of the tallest statue. After staring at it for a moment, a rumbling sound could be heard coming from the statue. Fine cracks appeared on the statue, and white light leaked out from the cracks. The fragments fell down, but before they could touch the ground, they turned into dust and dispersed. In the end, like a cocoon breaking out of a cocoon, a Taoist walked out from the light. Dandy Guang had been told about the origins of all the statues. He knew that this Taoist was Tai Heng, and was once the founder of a sect. He had the most vitality and was the most likely to break. He didn't expect Heng to return so soon. He didn't want to say, "Tian, I'm here on the orders of the Grand Supreme to look after you." Although ancestor Tai Heng had turned into a statue, his consciousness was still intact. He could sense what was going on outside and knew why he was here. Otherwise, he wouldn't have broken free so quickly. He bowed and said, "Thank you for your help, fellow Taoist. How should I address you?" Dandy Guang replied, "I'm Dandy Guang, the former disciple of the founder. Since fellow Taoist has broken free, do you have a place to go?" Patriarch Tai Heng pondered for a moment before he sensed the other statues and said, "I was lucky enough to escape, so I can be considered to have some limited experience. However, these fellow Taoists are still trapped, so I'll stay here and see if I can help them escape. Is that all right?" When Dandy Guang heard this, a trace of respect appeared in his heart. He said, "Fellow Taoist Tai Heng, if you need anything, just tell me." Patriarch Tai Heng immediately thanked him and chatted with him for a bit more. Then, Dandy Guang left. He walked to a statue. The person in front of him had 2 swords on his back, and there was a sharp look in his eyes. He knew that this person had also flown over from the 9 continents. It was just that he had restrained himself a long time ago, so he had never met this person before. The fluctuations of this person's aura were especially strong. He had a feeling that this person would be able to escape on his own without his help. He sensed that there were about 3 people, including this person, whose auras were fluctuating violently. They were all cultivators of the 9 continents. After pondering for a moment, he went outside and sat down cross-legged. Then, he transmitted his thoughts and experience of breaking through the shackles. Time passed, and 200 years passed in the blink of an eye. Somewhere in Buxa Heaven, 2 Huanjin temple cultivators were sitting in front of a bonfire on a snowy cold plain. The fire was giving off a clear spiritual light. Not only did it drive away the coldness in the surroundings, but there was also a spiritual vigor that seeped into their bodies, replenishing the essence, qi, and mana that they had lost during the journey. One of the young cultivators with a strong figure meditated for a moment and recovered a little vitality. He said with a look of disbelief, "Senior brother Qi and I both have magic power. After walking for such a long time, we've been attacked by the coldness here. We feel that it's very exhausting. I don't know how the Nilien tribe migrated to the depths of this cold land." Senior brother Qi said, "It's nothing more than the blessing of the god." The cultivator sneered, "I'm afraid this god didn't expect that after working so hard, in the end, the tribe that he was protecting suddenly changed their faith to the devil god. I don't know if he's incompetent or just unlucky." After the Taoist magic receded, the number of gods also gradually increased. Other than the main gods who had been officially conferred, there were also some minor gods who had only received the grace of the gods. They only belonged to the god court in name, but in reality, the god court did not treat them as anything. They could only survive by receiving worship, so they had a coexisting relationship with living beings. They had to work hard for the living beings to enjoy the incense, but if they did not bring any benefits, or if they could not protect the tribe, then once the people of the tribe turned to believe in another god, they would be replaced. The young cultivator sneered, "I heard that this tribe worshipped gods from the lower realm. There are many gods in Buxa Heaven. If one doesn't work, they can just change to another. Why would they believe in some lower realm god?" For the cultivators in Buxa Heaven, except for the mountain and sea realm and the myriad heavens, the other realms were despicable places, not worthy of much attention. Senior brother Qi said, "The lower realm is flourishing now, and I heard that there are many powerful people there. Our cultivation is still shallow, and we don't have the ability to look down on them." The young cultivator said helplessly, "Senior brother is right." Senior brother Qi stood up, waved his sleeve, and extinguished the fire. He said, "Since we've rested enough, we should be on our way. Junior brother, be careful. In this remote place, either nothing happens, or something big happens." The cultivator smiled bitterly. "Senior brother, you've said that more than once. I understand." However, although he said so, he didn't really take it to heart. This time, the sect only heard the report from the original god of the tribe, saying that the tribe believed in the devil god, so they ordered them to come and check it out. However, it could be seen that the sect didn't attach much importance to this. Otherwise, They wouldn't have not even given them a flying ship and only allowed them to fly over by themselves. Senior brother Chi didn't say anything else. He packed up his things and, according to the rules, sent a letter to the sect. The two of them rode on the mysterious light and continued on to their destination. But after half a day, they saw a line of green appear on the ground. When they got closer, they saw bits of vegetation, and the deeper they went, the denser it became. At this time, they could clearly feel the cold begin to fade away, replaced by a sense of spring. Both of them were shocked. They hadn't expected that there would be such an oasis in the depths of this cold plain. They couldn't help but look at each other, bewildered. Although their eyesight was limited, it wasn't difficult to see that this place didn't look like it was naturally formed. To create such a large oasis, the supernatural power involved must be extremely shocking. Did the devil god of the lower realm that this tribe worshipped have such great ability? The two of them continued forward. Unexpectedly, what they thought they would see next was an impoverished tribe, but who would have thought that standing in front of them was a grand city built from stone and wood? This city was surrounded by water on 3 sides, and one side faced a cliff. It was a very magnificent sight. The houses and pavilions in the city were built in an incomparably neat manner, and there were patterns and engravings on them, as well as colorful lines. Most of the people here wore long robes and short sleeves, with jade belts around their waists. Their hair was neatly combed, and the people of the tribe all had rosy complexions and were full of energy. It was impossible to tell that this was a barbaric tribe. Out of caution, the two of them only looked at the place of worship from afar and didn't dare to go near. But even so, they still alarmed the people of the Ni Lien tribe. They thought that there would be a conflict, and they were prepared for the worst. But unexpectedly, the Ni Lien tribe didn't have the slightest hostility towards them. Instead, they were very surprised that there were outsiders here. They warmly invited them into the city and set up a banquet to entertain them. In the end, they even generously showed them the place of worship. The Ni Lien tribe worshipped a headless statue. It had hands and feet, and its body was covered with scales and hair. Its appearance was strange, and it was no wonder that the previous deity treated it as a devil god. But in the eyes of the two, the people worshipping the statue were all clear-minded, and their power was abnormally pure. They couldn't see any evil spirits. Logically speaking, Huanzhen Temple was only suppressing evil spirits. Since the target wasn't a devil, it was just a strange appearance. Similar deities could be said to be everywhere in Bushtian, so there wasn't much to investigate. But they always felt that this matter wasn't that simple. After the two of them stayed in the city for a few days, they then returned to the mountain gate of the Kunshi continent and reported the matter seriously. The Zhenren in charge of the subsect looked at the description of the statue that the two of them handed over and the set of sacrificial ritual. He personally deduced it and found that the other party was indeed not a devil. But he also felt that something was wrong. Because it was confirmed that the other party was good and not evil, it wasn't Huanzhen Temple's place to interfere. After all, this deity had already taken over the position and could be considered as a person of the heavenly court. So after thinking about it, he wrote 2 letters. One was to report to the upper sect, and he asked someone to send it to Zhang Zhen. The other was to be sent to the heavenly court, and he wanted them to investigate it further. But he also knew that the second letter might not have any results, because the heavenly court only listened to the orders of Yuan Zun, and they might not pay much attention to his letters. The key was still to see how the upper sect would react. Chapter 2149. Very quickly, Zhang Zhen received the letter from the subheadmaster. As none of the subheadmasters of the Huanzhen Temple had retreated, there were quite a number of such reports. Such matters could be handed over to the elders of the temple, but she was especially concerned about this matter. She had to read through all the reports personally. This time, she also felt that something was amiss. Immediately, she circulated her spirit and tried to deduce, but then she frowned. Originally, she wanted to see the background of these people before deciding how to deal with them. But now, she realized that she could not see through the origin of the deity behind them. She immediately became alert. Even she could not deduce the origin of the deity. She could not even sense a single clue, which meant that the level of the person who created the incantation was above her. Yet, such a mighty person chose to impart the incantation in a wasteland. What was he trying to do? She thought to herself, this matter cannot be belittled, I have to inform my brother. Just as she had this thought, there was a knock on the door from outside the inner room. She said, Headmaster, just now, a letter has been sent from beyond the heavens. Zhang Zhen said, bring it in. The maid walked in and placed the letter on the table. She bowed and then retreated. Zhang Zhen picked it up and took a look, only to find that it was sent by her elder brother. It said that he already knew about this matter. There were a lot of things involved in this matter, and the implications were relatively big. He told her not to intervene. Even if there was such a technique that was spread to other places, she should let it go and pretend that she didn't see it. Since her brother was concerned about this matter, she was relieved. She immediately ordered someone to instruct the sub-headmaster not to bother about this matter and not to bother about it in the future. Zhang Yan sat in meditation and saw clearly that the incantation in the wasteland was actually the Dao technique that Zhizhuang Daoren had sent to the world. For hundreds of years, this Dao technique had begun to spread, but most of it was actively promoted by Zhizhuang. Very few of them strengthened themselves. There was a reason for this. Although this Dao technique was easy to learn, and one only needed to worship at the beginning to obtain supernatural powers, there was no obvious advantage when compared to other Dao techniques. This was because this incantation pointed directly to the great Dao, so it was destined that the higher one went, the more difficult it would be. If one did not cultivate to a certain level, it would be difficult to obtain stronger powers. Even if there were a few people who were gifted, it was impossible for anyone to reach too high in just a few hundred years. Now that the spiritium in the world was flourishing, facing the endless number of ferocious monsters, the first thing those who sought to survive in the world had to consider was how to survive. In that case, techniques that could immediately obtain extraordinary power were the first choice. For example, the incantation that Wei Zihong created was like this. Although it could not be used to reach the upper level, it was extremely fast to learn. Because of the different Dharma pearls, it could be combined with many other methods. It could even be used by men, women, old, and young. The only difference was the power. Therefore, apart from the remote places, almost all the people in the world were occupied by this incantation. It had become the mainstream. In general, Zhizhuang stood at too high a level, so he would not consider the needs of the living beings at the bottom. He might not be unaware of the reason, but as a Grand Supreme, he would definitely not succumb to the will of mortals. Therefore, for the time being, there was not much of a threat, so there was no need for him to be in a hurry to resist. In the eastern wasteland, the Tao had been cut off for more than 300 years, and the 100 nations of the eastern wasteland were in constant turmoil. And because of the flourishing of spirit qi, demons and other creatures gradually began to spread. This, however, caused the upper echelons of the nations to be more united than before. As for the feudal vassals that were not part of the 100 nations, they would not pay much attention to them. The southern tip of the eastern wastelands, where the Chen Mountain was located, had now been renamed the Hai Xing Nation. Back then, because this place had obtained the legacy stone tablet, even without the legacy of the path, it had still obtained the ability to protect itself in the world. Moreover, because many natives who lived on the various islands in the sea had fled to the Hai Xing Nation, the power of the nation had instead flourished. But even so, the people of the nation had a hard time. After all, it was close to the 100 southern sea continent, and there were countless demons there. Even if the bull dragon tribe sought refuge with the various sects of the mountain and sea continent, they could not control such a large territory. Therefore, there would be a battle with the demons every once in a while. This caused the population of the nation to be maintained at less than 1 million, and it was difficult to increase it any further. It was not that the middle and upper echelons of the nation did not consider moving to other places, but there were very few places in the eastern wasteland that could be inhabited, unless they went to the western desolate domain. But that place was vast and sparsely populated, and there were many demons and other creatures there. At least, they were more familiar with the creatures there, and they had a set of effective ways to fight against them. They really could not afford to change to an unfamiliar environment and have to adapt from the beginning. Gao Chengtu stood in front of the stone tablet. There were still so many inscriptions on the tablet. It was no different from the first time he saw it when he was a child. But every time he saw it again, as his cultivation improved, he could see many different things. Over the years, the techniques that Wei Zihong and many of his fellow disciples had derived had also been passed down here. However, none of the clansmen who had cultivated the Dao technique on the tablet had ever turned back to cultivate it. This was because the cultivation of this technique did not require any external objects. As long as one could understand the meaning behind it, even if one was illiterate, one would still be able to cultivate magic power in one's body. This meant that even the clansmen at the lowest level could enter the sect through this method, and they did not need to pay anything extra. As the first person to benefit from the stone tablet, Gao Chengtu's cultivation was now comparable to that of the core transformation elder in the tribe. But he had never had the difference of black light and evil qi that cultivators in the past talked about. He only had the pure magic power that he had cultivated all the way up. He was already at this level more than 100 years ago, but for a whole 100 years, there was no progress at all. The clansmen who were left behind by him had obviously surpassed him, and the latecomers were gradually catching up. He knew that this was because he had never figured out that when he practiced, he did not need external medicine, nor did he need to breathe spiritual vigor. So where did his power come from? If it was from the inside, there was no such huge power in the human body. Otherwise, he would have long been like a demon. This was like a demon in his heart, making him unable to move forward. But those of the same generation who did not bother about this at all, on the contrary, easily crossed over. Because this generation never cared about where the power came from. As long as the power really existed, why should they care about where it came from? How did the heaven and earth come from? How did the living beings come from? Could they really figure it out? Why should they bother about it? After thinking for a few nights, Gao Chengtu finally made up his mind. One morning, he visited the Gao clan's elder in Haisheng country, who was also the Gao clan's clan leader. What? You want to go out to seek Dao? The Gao clan's clan leader was very surprised when he heard the purpose of his visit. Gao Chengtu said, "Yes, I need to figure out one thing. I heard that there are similar stone tablets being found everywhere. I don't know if the Dharma access they practice is the same as in Haisheng country. If I see it, maybe I can verify it. Moreover, this Dharma access must have a source. The clan leaders have also said that it is very likely that it was built by the Almighty in the 9 continents. If there is a chance, I would like to personally ask this Almighty to see if he can solve the doubts in my heart." The Gao clan's elder pondered for a long time. To be honest, every Gao clan member who had some achievements in the Dharma access was precious. Even if they did not improve for a long time, there were only a few who could cultivate to such a level of mana. He sighed and said, "It seems that the country is still too small for you. Since you insist on leaving, I can't stop you. It's better for you to leave early." Gao Chengtu cupped his hands and said, "Thank you, elder brother." The Gao clan's elder looked at him with a complicated gaze and said, "Will you come back?" Gao Chengtu said honestly, "I don't know." Although he had never been to the outside world, he could see a little bit from the situation in Haisheng Mountain. Not to mention those earth-shattering monsters and monsters. He really did not know if he could return safely. The Gao clan's Daoran said, "If you can come back, try to. This is your hometown after all. Even if my generation is gone, there are still your descendants here." Gao Chengtu said solemnly, "Chengtu will not forget." He cupped his hands and turned to leave. After he returned home, he first said goodbye to his clan members. Because he already had a plan for this matter, he simply packed up and flew into the sky. This time, he planned to first go west and search for Taoist techniques in the Western Absolute Domain. Then, he would turn north and go around the 6 continents of the North Sea. If everything went smoothly, he would finally go south and return to Haisheng Mountain. Patriarch Taiheng was sitting cross-legged in the cave in the temporary world sky, and he was still transmitting his thoughts to the statues. Suddenly, his brows raised slightly, and he looked towards a certain direction. The aura of a statue was seeping out, and he knew that another fellow Taoist was about to escape after him. However, this time around, it was different from when the outer wall had cracked like scales when he had first come out. A thin crack had appeared in the middle of the statue, as if it had been split by a sharp sword. Brilliant golden light flashed and disappeared within the crack, after which all the restraining force was eliminated in one go. A moment later, a Taoist with a cold appearance walked out from within. He had a straight nose, a sharp face, and wore the sun and moon united robe. 2 swords of energy could be faintly seen on his back, and he emanated a sharp aura. The man cupped his hands and bowed to Patriarch Tai Heng, saying, "Thank you, fellow Taoist." Patriarch Tai Heng returned the bow and shook his head, saying, "There's no need. It wasn't my strength that helped fellow Taoist escape." Although he had passed on his experience of escaping to the other party was extremely arrogant and didn't accept it at all. However, the other party clearly appreciated his good intentions. The Taoist looked around and said, "May I ask where this is?" His cultivation was inferior to Patriarch Tai Heng's, so he didn't feel much in the chaotic sky. He only knew that he had been transferred to another place. Before Patriarch Tai Heng could answer, clear lights flashed outside. It seemed that several people had arrived. He looked over and saw Dandy walking in alone. He cupped his hands and bowed to the Taoist, saying, "This place is nameless. It is a place that the founding ancestor casually opened. If Lord Hong Yu really doesn't understand, you can come with me. I will answer your questions." Chapter 2150. Hong Yu also wanted to know what had happened in the 9 continents after he had broken the world barrier, and what was going on in the outside world. Therefore, he agreed to Dandy Light's request and went with him. A day later, he finally turned around and came back. Patriarch Tai Heng said, "Fellow Taoist, where do you want to go?" Hong Yu said, "I have nowhere to go at the moment. After attaining manifestation, my cultivation has been wasted for too long, and I need to cultivate quietly. This place is not bad. It's rich in spiritual opportunity, and there's purple clear to use." Patriarch Tai Heng looked at him and said, "Perhaps I shouldn't have brought this up. However, there was a reason for the death of the Primal Yang sect. Fellow Taoist, you should understand." Hong Yu said in a calm tone, "Since I have broken the boundary and cut off my past body, I am no longer related to my original sect. The disciples of the younger generation are not capable and are killed by others. Who is to blame? I don't have the time to care about this." Patriarch Tai Heng said, "If that's what you think, that's for the best." For the past 300 years, he hadn't just sat here and did nothing. He had also tried to understand the past of the 9 continents. The destruction of the Primal Yang sect was actually because it had sided with Yu Xiao. This matter had something to do with the current overlords of the Mountain and Sea Realm, Qinsong, Shaoqing, and even the All Heavens sections. It was even possible that the Exalted One behind it was involved. This was undoubtedly a tight net. He believed that even if Hong Yu had a grudge, it was best to bury it or just abandon it. Otherwise, it would only be disadvantageous to him. As the 2 of them spoke, there was a sudden noise in the cave. They looked over and saw that 2 statues had collapsed. Clearly, the 2 of them had not been able to return. Patriarch Tai Heng sighed. When the statues had collapsed in the muddy sky, he hadn't seen his soul escape. He had thought that it had been worn away by the Almighty's Weili. But now he hadn't seen it either. This meant that if he couldn't escape, he would really die. He wouldn't even have a chance to reincarnate. Hong Yu didn't speak any further. He cupped his hands at Tai Heng and left. After that, he found a place nearby, opened up an abode that could only fit him, and sat down within it to enter into closed-door cultivation. Patriarch Tai Heng shook his head, sat down cross-legged, and continued to transmit his consciousness. This time, he told everyone that if they couldn't escape, their souls would be annihilated. In this way, under the situation where they had no way out, perhaps a few people would be able to escape. After Gaocheng left Haixing country, he headed west. Sometimes he flew, sometimes he used the shifting spell altar to cross the mountains. However, along the way, he saw that most of the people cultivated the art of external elixir. This external elixir technique was also the technique that Wei Zihong used to refine the demon's blood essence. However, the Dharma bead was not an inner elixir, and it was an external cultivation technique, so it was called external elixir. This Yu alchemy, and alchemy Yu Gao was to learn more. Alor the sect. However, no matter how abundant the materials were, they still needed to be gathered from the outside world. Besides that, there was still a need for people to produce and cultivate the land. So, this alchemy was bound to be something only the people of the upper echelons could do. Of course, this wasn't much different from the past. After all, no matter if it was a clan or a nation, cultivation had always been something that very few people did. Moreover, he noticed that even though cultivating this alchemy would increase one's strength and spirit and prolong one's lifespan to a certain extent, it would at most extend one's lifespan by 200 to 300 years. On the other hand, even though there was a barrier he hadn't overcome with the alchemy he cultivated, it could at least extend his lifespan for another 400 to 500 years. So long as he resolved the barrier in his Tao, then he would undoubtedly be able to obtain even more lifespan. However, he rarely saw people who cultivated the same alchemy as him. So, every time he arrived at a place, he would pass down the alchemy he knew. Once there were more people like this, not only would it increase the number of people who could deal with demons, there would also be more people who could exchange Tao with him in the future. He traveled and stopped like this, and 30 years later, he passed through the natural moat and arrived at the Western Absolute Territory. As soon as he arrived here, he felt a sense of desolation. This place was desolate, and there were almost no mortal nations here. However, he encountered many scattered heavenly ghost tribes. When they saw that he was a cultivator, they were respectful and fearful, and they all avoided him. Only some heavenly ghost children dared to come close and size him up. He didn't have much intention to interact with these kinds of beings. He had only come here to search for the alchemy stone steel that might have fallen here. After a few fruitless searches, he found a teleportation altar, and an old cultivator at the mystic light realm was guarding it. This person had a head full of white hair, and his aura was weak. He seemed to be at the end of his lifespan. Because it was rare to see a cultivator come here, the old man was very warm to him. After chatting with him, the old man found out that the old man had only managed to cultivate this ability after the alchemy stone steel was cut off, and he was quite shocked. Thus, he carefully asked about how to cultivate this alchemy stone steel. Gao Qingtu didn't hide anything about this alchemy stone steel and taught it all to him. The old cultivator said gratefully, "I originally thought that after my body decayed, it would be hard for me to step onto the path of Tao again. However, with fellow Taoists' alchemy stone steel, I can still cultivate it in my next life." When he said that, he paused for a moment. "Fellow Taoist, please wait for a moment." He went to the inner cellar of the altar and rummaged around for a while before taking out a map. Since fellow Taoist wants to find Tao, you can only go to the Human Path tribe. Just now is the best. This map records the distribution of the alchemy stones and the locations of the tribes in the Absolute Territory. The places that are specially circled with a red brush are the places where the ferocious beasts live. Although it's from 30 years ago, it should still be useful. After Gao Qingtu took it and looked through it, he couldn't help but express his gratitude. This thing was very useful to him, especially since it marked the places where the ferocious beasts roamed. He could avoid many dangers and continue his journey. The old cultivator said, "It's good that fellow Taoist is satisfied. Now that we're parting, I don't think we'll meet again in the future. I've hidden some good wine. I'll call a few fellow Taoists over to drink together as a farewell gift." Gao Qingtu gladly accepted. After resting for another night, he bid farewell to the old cultivator the next day and continued his journey to the west. Because of the map's guidance, he only needed to follow the directions on the map to find his way step by step. It really saved him a lot of effort. This time, he spent more than 10 years visiting every Human Path tribe in the Absolute Territory of the Western Sky. Everywhere he went, he taught the alchemy stone steel that he had learned to those who were willing to learn it. The Human Path tribes in the Absolute Territory of the Western Sky were usually sheltered under the various subsects of the Shaoqing sect. After these subsects alchemy stone steel were cut off, they also tried to find ways to replace alchemy stone steel. External alchemy stone steel was also the mainstream here, but there were still some problems. Now that he came, the tribes here had another choice. Once, he saw that a few youths in a tribe were very talented, so he stayed for a year and imparted his cultivation experience to them. After one of the youths got the method, he sincerely asked him, "May I ask, Master, what's the name of this method?" It was not the first time that Gao Chengtu was asked this question. He thought for a while and answered, "This alchemy stone steel was created by a mighty person. I don't know its origin. I just happened to get a chance like you, and just now I've learned it. I can't name it myself. If you think it's inconvenient, you can find a name yourself." After leaving this place, he continued to the west. After about 30 years, he walked to the absolute territory of the west. The scenery here was very different from the wilderness he imagined. On the vast plain, there were giant trees that connected the sky and the earth. The lush canopies simply covered the sky. After he paid a visit to the two owners of this place, he found out that these two were originally Taoist cultivators. Because they were both individual cultivators, and they were unwilling to enter the inner world, they stayed here for the night. Here, he saw a unique method that was different from the others. Those who learned this method only needed to plant a seed, wait for the fruit to bear, and swallow it. Then, they would be able to absorb all kinds of vitality and essence from the same plant and use it to nourish themselves. Those who practiced this method didn't have much fighting power, but they could control all kinds of magical plants and vines to help them. Moreover, the more lush the plants were, the more techniques they could use. Gao Chengtu's horizons were widened, and the people here were also very interested in the alchemy stone steel that he brought, and they were willing to communicate with him. He stayed here for 3 years. Originally, there would be very few traces of the alchemy stone steel heading west, but he heard that there might be ancient ruins in the depths of the wilderness, so he wanted to go and explore. When the two owners of this place heard that he was going to leave, they gave him a lot of seeds. As long as they were planted, they would grow into a strange tree in less than 2 hours. Inside the tree, there would be a net of vines for people to rest in. In the wilderness, they could also provide enough water and fruits for people to wrap their stomachs. After Gao Chengtu thanked them, he left. As he followed him into the depths of the wilderness, he found that it wasn't that there were no people here, but that there were many heavenly ghost tribes living here, and they were very hostile to him. In order to avoid trouble, he stayed as far away as possible. After half a year, he finally found the rumored ruins. However, although there were many things left behind from ancient times, he didn't find any stone steels inscribed with alchemy stone steels. However, on the night that he was about to leave, he suddenly felt a tremor down below. Then, he saw a 300-meter-tall screen of spiritual light rise up. He was very surprised. Thanks to the map that the old cultivator had given him, he was able to recognize that this was a gate between two realms. However, it wasn't on the map, and perhaps it wasn't built by the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm. He had no idea when it had been built. He had originally been prepared to turn around and return to his hometown. However, he hadn't been able to find the answers he was looking for on his journey to seek the Tao. In that case, this gate might be his chance. However, he didn't know what the realm on the other side looked like. If he took a step forward, he might be consigned to eternal damnation. He thought about the gate for a long time before his expressions suddenly became determined. Then he stepped into the gate, and in the blink of an eye, he disappeared along with the gate. Zhang Yan's clone was in the Azure Sky Temple, watching all of this play out. Ever since his true self had passed on his Taoist magic, many tribes had acquired it. However, among all of them, Gao Chengtu was the only one who had thought deeply about the principles of the Taoist magic and had put it into action. He had taken the initiative to pass on his Taoist magic, and as a result, more and more people had come into contact with the Taoist magic. People like him could be helped along the way. However, the Taoist magic that he had passed on didn't just fall into the mountain and sea realm, but also into the myriad of other heavens. Because of that, it was impossible to find the answers to the Taoist magic in one realm. Therefore, the Taoist magic had to be guided to other realms. If that person could take advantage of the opportunity, it would not only be beneficial to that person, it would also be beneficial to the transmission of the Taoist magic. Chapter 2151. Zhang Yan was sitting in the Qinghuan Palace. At this moment he was immersed in the divine will, looking at the petal of the creation Pauline. The petal shone brightly, as if it was made of condensed splendor. It looked a little bigger than before. After hundreds of years of searching, it was not that he had not gained anything. He had indeed drawn a part of the creation Pauline's power, but every time he could only gather an extremely small wisp of it, and he could not find the source of it. Moreover, he realized that even without his interference, this Pauline was also in the process of recovering. It was just that if he did not pay attention, it would be very difficult to notice. Because of his interference, just now, there was such an obvious change in front of him. In this way, the more complete Pauline in Zhizhuang Doran's hand should be in the same situation. There was a period of time when he did not deliberately search for it, but this Pauline did not change much. This proved that after the separation of Pauline, she would not grow stronger because of each other, and this kind of evolution was completely independent. He used this item to simulate the battle with Zhizhuang Doran again. This time, it was still a draw as it had been in the past. However, it wasn't completely useless. Every single time, he would be able to find out where he was lacking. At this point, the reason he was unable to suppress his opponent was purely because of the lotus of good fortune. At this moment, he felt a sense in his heart, and he retreated from the divine will. When his mind descended, he found that the Weili that had spread out had found a place of creation. However, the mana of Zhizhuang Doran had also found this place, so the mana incarnations of the two sides naturally collided. At this moment, in the place of creation, the two Weili sides met. After several battles, neither side could drive the other out. There was already a void around them, and the worlds attached to the place of creation had all collapsed. Only the two Weili sides were facing each other. Zhizhuang Doran's original body had obviously noticed this as well. He focused his mind in and stopped his mana incarnation from fighting. Then he bowed and said, "Fellow Taoist, please slow down. Can you listen to me for a moment?" Zhang Yan's consciousness also landed here. His mana incarnation also retracted his hand and bowed, saying, "Please speak." Zhizhuang Doran said, "Fellow Taoist should also understand that the two of us are currently in a stalemate. If we continue to fight like this, neither of us will be able to occupy this place, and it will be of no benefit to either of our clans. Zhang Yan, if you have something to say, you can speak frankly." Zhizhuang Doran said, "Rather than you and I being at loggerheads, why don't we divide this place?" Zhang Yan's eyes flickered and he said, "Oh? Could it be that fellow Taoist can divide the land of fortune?" After the destruction of the essence of fortune, all the lands of fortune existed on their own. It was difficult to fuse them together, and it was even more impossible to divide them. In other words, among the Taoists that he knew of, no one had the ability to do so. Although the fragment of fortune could be integrated into the land of fortune, it was a fragment because it could no longer form a whole. Therefore, the present world that resided on the fragment was not eternal. It could exist for a long time, but it would eventually collapse. It was not like the appearance of Bu Su Tian. As long as Bu Su Tian was present, it could continue to exist. If Zhizhuang Doran had a way to divide the land of fortune, even if he was relying on creation Pauline, he would have to re-evaluate his ability. Zhizhuang Doran said, "When I say divide and rule, I don't mean to divide this land of fortune. I don't have the ability to do so. Instead, I want to draw a boundary from within. Each of us will control a piece of land, and neither of us will be the master. If there are external enemies, we can work together to defend against them. What does fellow Taoist think?" Zhang Yan thought for a while. Although this land of fortune was much smaller than the ones he had seen before, he did not intend to give it up so easily. It was just that if they continued to fight like this, it would not be beneficial to either side. Working together to rule it was a solution. This was because their agreement was based on the premise that neither side could do anything to the other. It was only a temporary measure. Once one side's power surpassed the other, they would not hesitate to take back the other half of the control. He could also guess that the other party might have some ulterior motives for proposing this plan. However, he was not afraid that the other party would play tricks. His mana incarnation was here, and if there was any accident, he would be able to discover it. Moreover, Ji Zhuang could not become the master, so he could not use the Weili here. Thus, his power did not increase. So, he nodded and said, "This method is feasible. Then we will use our mana as a boundary to divide and rule." Seeing that he agreed, Zhizhuang Daoren said, "Since you and I have met today, why don't we set a rule? If we encounter such a situation in the future, we will follow this rule. What do you think?" Zhang Yan thought for a while. Although the possibility of the two of them discovering the same land of fortune was small, it was not impossible. Direct conflict would not solve the problem. Moreover, before they found a way to deal with the other party, doing this would undoubtedly balance the interests of both sides. So, he said, we can temporarily use this as an example. Zhizhuang Daoren then said, "There is one more thing that I would like to tell fellow Taoist. I met a fellow Taoist who became a treasure spirit in the real world. I was just talking to him, but he was not willing to give up on his cultivation. He was still stubbornly trying to improve himself. If he were to call that person back, all our arrangements would be for naught. Why don't fellow Taoists join me in eliminating him?" Zhang Yan did not say a word. Zhizhuang Daoren saw that he was not willing to agree. He said regretfully, "If fellow Taoist is not willing, I will not force you. I will solve this matter." He could tell that Zhang Yan would not do it the last time. So, he said it as a greeting. As long as the latter did not hinder him, it would be fine. The two of them settled this matter. Using the place where the two Weili confronted each other as a boundary, they each retreated. Zhang Yan's mana doppelganger moved his mind. In an instant, the collapsed myriad heavens and realms that just now had been restored. However, this fragment was discovered by them just now, so there were no living beings here. At this moment, under the urging of his mind, living beings also evolved. He could see that Zhizhuang Daoren had also reconstructed the myriad heavens and realms, but he did not urge living beings like him. Instead, he allowed them to evolve on their own. However, now that the spiritual opportunity of the myriad heavens and realms was flourishing, living beings would eventually appear. At that time, they would definitely spread Dao techniques to this world. This should also be one of his main intentions. After a moment of thought, he decided that there was no harm in spreading the Taoist techniques he had developed, and taking advantage of the opportunity to compare the two Taoist techniques. Mountain and Sea Realm. Winged Sky Continent. Phoenix Cry Gorge. The sect leader of the Clear Feather sect, Tao Zhenhong, stood on a platform in a golden temple, his sleeves flapping in the wind. A jade scroll floated in front of him, and every so often he would use his finger as a pen to write on it. Ever since their Taoist techniques had been severed, the Clear Feather sect had been searching for a way to continue. Their techniques had always focused on controlling outsiders, and therefore, they had begun by raising demons. He had seen Wei Zihong's technique, and found it to be an excellent one. It was very suitable for the current situation, and was somewhat in line with the Clear Feather sect's approach. However, any sect that wanted to succeed would not allow their disciples to cultivate techniques from outside. This was not because they were hostile, but rather because they were determined to pass on their Taoist techniques. If their disciples cultivated a technique created by their own sect, then even if it was inferior to the external techniques, they would still acknowledge it, and their lineage could be said to have not been severed. However, if they cultivated an external technique, even if the cultivator acknowledged it, after several generations or even dozens of generations, or after the cultivator reincarnated, they would definitely not treat themselves as the cultivators of their original sect. According to what he knew, Shaoqing and Qinsong created their own Taoist techniques, and these two sects had many powerhouses. It was not difficult for them to derive a Taoist technique that could be used by their disciples from their original techniques. In fact, they could even use great magic power to forcefully increase the abilities of some of their disciples who reincarnated. Therefore, the Clear Feather sect also needed a technique that could be used for a long time, and was not weaker than the external Taoist techniques. Today, their hard work over the past few centuries could finally come to an end. At this moment, a disciple walked up to the platform, bowed, and said, "Sect leader, all the elders have arrived." Tao Zhenhong stretched out his hand and pointed. The Clear Feather's spiritual light spun for a moment before closing. He waved his sleeve and passed the bundle of jade slips to the disciple, saying, "Take this and show it to the elders." The disciple carefully received it, bowed, and retreated. After a long while, the disciple turned back, and his voice carried a hint of excitement as he said, "Sect leader, all the elders praised your technique for being very suitable for our sect. Even if the Taoist techniques return in the future, this technique can still be passed down for generations." Tao Zhenhong sighed and said, "It's a pity that it's 400 years late. Many talented disciples couldn't enter the Tao because of this." The disciple said, "But with sect leader's technique, won't there be more chances to enter the Tao?" Tao Zhenhong shook his head and said, "There's only one chance in a lifetime. Sometimes if you miss it, you'll miss it." Although the heavenly workings were endless, and everyone had a chance to enter the Tao, if they missed the most suitable lifetime to enter the Tao, it would be very difficult to get another chance. He turned around and walked down the wide platform's jade steps. When he reached the bottom, 2 disciples immediately pushed open the gold-bronze door in front of him. He walked out and was already standing on a high platform. In the grand hall below, the 20 or so elders present all stood up and bowed in unison. "Greetings, sect leader." Tao Zhenhong took a few steps forward and sat down on the sect leader's seat. He waved his horsetail whisk and said, "Elders, please take a seat and talk." The elders expressed their gratitude before taking their seats. Tao Zhenhong then said, "Today's world is about to enter the era where all the techniques compete. If the Clear Feather sect wants to stand in the mountains and seas and protect the sect from falling, the only way is to spread Tao techniques." An elder below agreed and said, "I agree with sect leader. I heard that after Anna Temple's Tao techniques were cut off, not only did they not withdraw their sects like other sects, they even sent more people. Now, Anatta Temple's reputation is known throughout the universe, and their techniques are also seen as one of the orthodox techniques after the Tao techniques were cut off. Our sect's situation is similar to Anatta Temple's, and if we can imitate it." Tao Zhenhong shook his head. The reason why Anatta Temple's reputation increased so much was that this sect was good at killing evil spirits. In the current situation where Spiritium was flourishing, there was a place for it to exist in the universe. However, this could not be imitated because Clear Feather sect was not as good as Anatta Temple. After all, Anatta Temple was one of the original 10 great Xian men of the 9 continents. They had a deep foundation, so imitating it was absolutely impossible. He looked at his seat and said, "My Clear Feather sect has its own way of doing things. There's no need for us to imitate others. From what I see, all the techniques are practiced on the continent, and the ocean is where our Tao techniques go." Chapter 2152. After Zhang Yan and Jizhuang Daoren divided the land of creation, he turned his consciousness back and continued to search for the power of creation Pauline. At the same time, he observed Bu Shutian and unraveled the unknown. Before he knew it, another 500 years had passed. As the cultivators of the various worlds hid in the inner world, their lifespans were protected by the mana of a few true young almighties. Therefore, other than not being able to move about in the outer world, there did not seem to be much change on the surface. However, after thousands of years, the outer world was very different from the past. After the extinction of Tao techniques, many successor techniques rose up one after another. Some were only circulated in remote areas, while others became universal techniques in all worlds. For example, the external alchemy was one of them. This was also because the methods created by the major sects were only passed on to their own disciples, so they did not have much influence on the outside world. On the other hand, once the technique that Zhang Yan passed down took root in a certain place, it would flourish for a long time. Although this technique could not be considered to be truly perfect, It did not require any external objects or cultivation methods. This point alone was enough to be accepted by everyone. Therefore, even though the requirements for cultivating this method were not low, it was often the first choice of people. If one could not achieve success with this method, then they would consider other methods. As for the method passed down by Zhizhuang Daoren, it was still not widely spread. Usually, it was only passed down in the most remote areas, or even in a single clan. However, Zhang Yan was very clear that as long as Zhizhuang was still around, this Dao technique would never disappear. Moreover, because this Dao technique was connected to the Great Dao, the further one went, the more advantageous it would be. Once one or two almighty cultivators were cultivated, this Dao technique would be firmly established and gradually become one of the mainstream Dao techniques. The outcome of this battle was still far from being decided. He turned his gaze to the land of creation that was separated from Taoist Zhizhuang. Hundreds of years had passed, and under the impetus of his mana, the living creatures were gradually flourishing. It would not be long before living beings would appear, and he would undoubtedly pass down the Dharma that he had created. As for the other half of the world that Zhizhuang Weili controlled, it was still barren because he didn't deliberately move it. However, he also noticed that Zhizhuang Weili's mind wasn't here, but he was searching for the treasure spirit that had escaped. The treasure spirit of creation should have been achieved before the emergence of spiritual opportunity. He believed that the land of creation that he and Zhizhuang found should be its original hiding place. However, in the face of Zhizhuang Daoren, even the protection of the land of creation was useless. It must have foreseen this scene, so it withdrew in advance. This was undoubtedly a wise choice, and it should be good at escaping and hiding. That was why Zhizhuang Daoren could not find it after such a long time. However, it was not easy to live in the silence. Not only did he have to avoid Zhizhuang Daoren, he also had to avoid that existence. However, with that existence around, it could undoubtedly distract most of Zhizhuang Daoren's thoughts, so it was not a bad thing. He calculated for a while, but he did not see any results. Obviously, in the long run, the possibility of Zhizhuang finding the treasure spirit was extremely small. However, he faintly felt that the mysteries of heaven were unpredictable, and it was difficult to determine the pros and cons, as if there were other mysterious variables hidden in it. In the mirror lake, the existence's soul was trapped in the gap between reality and illusion, and there had been no movement for a long time. Because his own consciousness could not communicate with the soul, he gradually fell into a stagnant state. Suddenly, he seemed to have sensed something and he woke up. He saw a figure standing in front of him and shouted, "Who's there?" The figure chuckled and said, "Friend, have you thought of escaping?" The soul clone stared at the figure. He was trapped by creation Pauline, but the other party could directly appear in front of him and talk to him, so he was definitely not simple. He asked doubtfully, "Who are you, and why do you want to help me?" The figure said, "Now that the world is fixed, it is difficult to change, and I am very disgusted. Only if you come out, can you break this stalemate." The soul clone sneered and said, "But I am trapped by creation Pauline, how can you help me get out?" The figure said leisurely, "It is not that there is no way. If creation Pauline and creation fight each other, then with your ability, it should not be difficult for you to get out." The soul clone was shocked and said, "You have creation Pauline in your hands?" The figure said, "Friend, you do not need to care about this. Today, I only came to ask if you are willing to get out. If you are not willing, then there is no need for me to stay here any longer." The soul clone asked, "When are you going to do it?" The figure said, "Since you are willing, then you only need to wait patiently. When the time is right, you will know." With that, he disappeared. The soul clone looked at the place where the figure disappeared. At this moment, he more or less understood the other party's method. This person must have found the divine decree left outside, and thus could use it to communicate with him. In this way, he could see the sincerity of this person. The other party did not spend so much effort just to say a few words to him. He could not help but consider the gains and losses. Although he was suppressed here, he had also avoided the pursuit of the original Lord God. However, even without him, the original Master God would still recover. It was just that the process would be extremely long. However, he could afford to wait. Once the original Master God summoned that person back, it wouldn't matter whether he was there or not. Therefore, waiting was also a choice. However, Zhizhuang Daoren might not let him wait until that time. He had a feeling that this person was also planning something big, especially since this person had creation Pauline. Maybe he would be dealt with before the time came. So if there was a chance to get out, he would definitely not give it up. Ancestor Yao Han's consciousness returned to his body, and said to Yu Lu and Yu Qiu sitting beside him, "It is done." Taoist Yu Lu sighed, "Do we really have to do this?" Ancestor Yao Han said, "This is a chance to break out of this situation. When Zhizhuang's Pauline is formed and all his power is gathered back, we will no longer be able to rise up, nor will we be able to reach the Tao realm. Are you two willing to do this?" Taoist Yu Qiu said, "If we are willing to submit, we can still maintain our current situation. But if that person devours everything, I will fall into eternal silence." Ancestor Yao Han laughed. "Don't worry, fellow Taoist. Even if this soul clone is devoured by that person, it will not be able to immediately devour everything. Zhizhuang and Taoist Shen Yuan will definitely come out to kill it, so this matter will not be that bad." Taoist Yu Qiu said, "Then can fellow Taoist tell us where to find the other creation Pauline?" Ancestor Yao Han calmly pointed outside. "Why bother looking? Isn't it just over there?" "Fellow Taoist, you mean?" The two looked in the direction he pointed and immediately reacted. When they learned of this, they were shocked. After a while, Taoist Yu Qiu said, "But who will go get it?" Ancestor Yao Han said, "Doesn't Su Ji already have a ready candidate?" Taoist Yu Qiu said, "His magic power is slightly weak. I'm afraid he won't be able to reach there." Forefather Yao Han looked at the two and smiled. "Fellow Taoists, how do you think this person was able to escape Taoist Zhizhuang's pursuit for so long?" He paused for a moment before saying, "I will teach him how to solve this problem." In the nameless world, Gao Qingta stood on a giant piece of driftwood, surrounded by surging waves. His entire body was constantly bobbing up and down with the waves, and it looked like he could be flipped over and thrown away at any moment. But every time a wave rolled over him, he was still firmly nailed in place. He looked up, and through the heavy haze, he could see a sun and 3 moons hanging high in the sky. He did not know where he was. If day and night were considered as a day here, then it would be more than 900 days. His surroundings were filled with the same scenery, and he did not see any land or island. The ocean seemed to have cleansed everything. Along the way, he did not see any signs of life. However, he didn't regret his choice. Before he crossed the realm gate, he had already thought of this possibility. The current situation was good, at least he didn't fall into the void. After a few more days, he calculated that it was almost 1,000 days. At this time, the wind and waves around him had subsided, and the sky was blue. He took out a jade slip and channeled his magic power into it. Naturally, the erosion runes appeared on it. The waves had come without any warning, so he couldn't meditate and cultivate. Whenever he had the time, he would deduce the erosion runes. This wasn't without its benefits. Although he still hadn't overcome the obstacle and his magic power cultivation hadn't improved, his understanding of Taoist techniques had deepened day by day. As he was deducing, he suddenly saw a huge shadow in the corner of his eye. Looking to the side, he saw the corpse of a giant sea beast floating on the surface of the water. He couldn't help but feel excited. Creatures rarely existed alone. Since he saw it, there must be other creatures nearby. Sure enough, not long after, a flock of strange-looking birds flew over. They landed on the giant beast's corpse, either pecking at it or looking left and right. He was even more excited. The appearance of these birds meant that there was most likely an island or continent nearby. At this moment, 1,000 miles away, 2 youths who looked to be about 13 or 14 years old, wrapped in beast skins and with bone blades at their waists, were running along a steep slope. Finally, they came to a stop on a cliff that was high above the sea. A sturdy boy rubbed his nose, which had been blown red by the wind, and twisted his body uneasily. He muttered, "Tan, what are we doing here?" The other teenager was thin and clever. He was looking at the sea with a nervous expression, as if waiting for something to appear. However, the longer he waited, the more anxious he became. He thought, it should be here. If I remember correctly, could it really be just a dream? No, Mother really made meat porridge this morning, and Father also went out to hunt. Then it can't be fake. At this time, he saw a black spot appear on the sea. His eyes lit up and he couldn't help but take 2 steps forward. He stood on tiptoe and looked over. Suddenly, he felt that he was grabbed. He turned his head and saw the thick-headed teenager complaining to him, "Ah, Tan, do you want to die?" Just now, the clever teenager found that he had unconsciously walked to the edge of the cliff and was about to fall. He was also frightened and broke into a cold sweat. However, he smiled and said, Thank you very much." The thick-headed teenager called Agua curled his lips. He was about to say something, but at this time, he suddenly opened his mouth. The clever young man also turned his head and saw that above the thin clouds that were swept by the sea breeze, there was a person with his back facing the golden clouds that were soaked in the morning sun. Facing the wind and waves, he flew over from above the endless ocean. Chapter 2153. In the nameless world, Gao Qingtu followed the guidance of 2 young men to the tribe. Before coming here, he had quickly learned the language of the place, and from the young man named Tan, he got a general idea of the situation. The tribe used to live on the plains of the Great River. However, a sudden flood had submerged almost all of the land that was known to be habitable, and the survivors had no choice but to move to the higher mountains. However, it was difficult to obtain food, and there was very little land that could be cultivated. They could only rely on the young and strong of the tribe to hunt and fish to survive. Because of the narrow living space, the population was limited. The tribe only had about 3,000 people, and if a natural disaster suddenly struck, everyone would be killed. His arrival quickly caused a commotion in the tribe. Ever since the flood, they had not seen any outsiders. This was because the mountain they occupied was the highest mountain in the continent, so many people believed that they were the only ones left in the world. However, when they learned that Gao Qingtu had flown over from the sea, they were even more excited. That was because hundreds of years ago, a sage had prophesied that a god would come from the north on a cloud, and that he would be able to repel the flood and save the people. Didn't his arrival confirm the prophecy? The tribe chief immediately invited him into his house, and offered him the best clothes and food. Gao Qingtu saw that the clothes were made of animal hide and sewn together with bone needles, and that the food was nothing more than ordinary salted meat. However, he didn't look down on them and accepted them solemnly. The tribe chief was very happy that Gao Qingtu had accepted his gifts, which meant that he was willing to help them. That meant that the tribe's chances of survival were even greater. Gao Qingtu didn't do anything immediately. He rested for the night, and then spent the next few days checking out the situation around the tribe. Soon, he had a general idea of what was going on. He came to this realm to seek the Tao and preach it. However, after visiting so many realms, he was very clear that the first thing the people here needed to solve was the problem of survival and nothing else. Without food, clothing, and warmth, they could face the threat of natural disasters at any time. How could they follow him to learn the Tao? At this point, the seeds he had brought from the mountain and sea realm would be very useful. They could grow into towering trees in the hard soil of the western sky badlands, so planting them here would be no problem. The only difficulty was that if these plants wanted to grow as tall as the ones he saw the other day, they would need spiritual opportunity. Although there was some spiritual opportunity in this world, it was not abundant. Hence, these spiritual trees would grow very slowly. It wasn't that he didn't have a way to solve this problem. He could use his mana to nurture it, and when it bore fruit and could feed more people, he could ask the children to follow him to learn Tao techniques. When they had cultivated their mana, he could turn it around and cultivate more spiritual trees. When their lives were inseparable from Tao techniques, the people in this world would naturally pay attention to it. However, all of these had to be maintained for a long time, so he only took out some straw mushrooms that could be effective in the short term. These things were originally symbiotic with spiritual trees, and could also be used to alleviate hunger. Moreover, once they grew into a large area, they could immediately solve the predicament that the tribe was facing. With his help, it only took 2 years for the tribe's situation to change dramatically. At this time, Gao Qingtu began to impart Dao techniques to the children who had come to cultivate the Dao. If the Dao techniques are strong enough, they can change the heavens and the earth. As far as I know, some almighty beings can even make the flood retreat with a wave of their hand. From his point of view, dealing with outsider demons was actually a bit easier, while dealing with heavenly tribulations was the most difficult. Unfortunately, the people of this world were facing the latter situation. Sitting below, Tan's eyes lit up and he asked, "Master, have you seen such people before?" Gao Qingtu shook his head. "I haven't, but they do exist." Then he looked at the children and said in a very certain tone, "But you can't do this. If you can cultivate your Dao techniques, you can also use the spiritual trees to create land. As long as the legacy is passed on, sooner or later, you will be able to create a land for yourselves." Inside the mirror lake, after ancestor Yao Han finished talking with Yu Qiu and Yu Lu, he sank into his divine will. Moments later, a white-faced, scholarly-looking cultivator with long hair appeared. This person was called Yuan Mei, the treasure spirit that Zhizhuang Daoren was chasing. He bowed and said, "Greetings, Taoist Yao Han. What business do you have with me?" Ancestor Yao Han returned the greeting and said, "Taoist Yao Han, it's useless for you to keep running like this. Sooner or later, Zhizhuang will find you." Yuan Mei had a distressed look on his face. He had been cultivating well in his original place, and who would have thought that a calamity would befall him? Taoist Zhizhuang had told him that, with his temper, he would have been fine with not cultivating Dao skills, as long as he could live a peaceful life. But Patriarch Yao Han wanted him to flee, which was a clear rejection of the idea. Now Zhizhuang would not allow him to live. He wasn't born a human cultivator and had never experienced the tempering of the Dao. He had always been an indecisive person, and when Patriarch Yao Han had instigated him, he had lost his head and fled. But now he regretted it. He wanted to concede, but was worried that Zhizhuang wouldn't let him off the hook. He was resentful and said, "If I didn't run away, this wouldn't have happened." Ancestor Yao Han said, "Do you think a treasure spirit like you will live? Not to mention, you have no way out now." Yuan Mi stammered, "But I can feel that Bu Su Tian also has a treasure spirit incarnation of fellow Taoists' mana spreading out. If I go to Bu Su Tian," Ancestor Yao Han chuckled. "As far as I know, Zhizhuang once invited Heavenly Chariot Lord Bu Su and Taoist Xian Yuan to capture you, but Taoist Xian Yuan did not agree. However, it is impossible for him to help you, and Zhizhuang will definitely be on guard against this. If you dare to reveal any clues at this time, I'm afraid you will be exposed." His voice paused for a moment. "Zhizhuang hasn't found you yet because he has other important matters to attend to. He hasn't put much effort into this matter. However, his power is constantly increasing, and you have no time to seek nourishment. You know what he is thinking." Yuan Mei smiled bitterly. "Then what do you think I should do?" Patriarch Yao Han said, "The only reason I have such a reputation is because I obtained a portion of the treasured lotus of good fortune. But if fellow Taoist has it, you won't have to fear Ji Manor." Yuan Mei was shocked. There is such a Pauline elsewhere? Soon after, a trace of doubt appeared in his mind, and he asked in confusion, "But since you have this item, why didn't you go and get it yourself?" Ancestor Yao Han sighed. "Do you think I don't want to? It's just that Zhizhuang is watching me, and I can't act rashly. Otherwise, why would I help you?" Yuan Mei lowered his head, thinking about something. Ancestor Yao Han knew that Yuan Mei's personality was like this, and he often couldn't make a decision, so he continued, "Make a decision quickly, Taoist. Zhizhuang will find a loophole in the concealment method sooner or later, and I don't need to tell you what will happen then." Yuan Mei hesitated. "Will it really work?" Ancestor Yao Han said, "If I didn't teach you the concealment method, how could you avoid Zhizhuang's pursuit? Don't worry, it will work. Of course, if you manage to escape, you will need to come back and help me." Yuan Mei said, "Then, what should I do?" He couldn't refuse, and he didn't know whether to refuse or not. He could only take it one step at a time. Ancestor Yao Han told him what to do and said, "There are some dangers here, especially after you obtain it. You will be exposed, so you will have to rely on yourself." He then said solemnly, "I only hope that you can succeed, or else all my efforts will be in vain." Yuan Mei said, "Yes, I will pay attention." Ancestor Yao Han did not retreat because if he allowed Yuan Mo to do things on his own, he would be hesitant to take the next step. Thus, he repeatedly urged Yuan Mo through his divine will. Yuan Mei had no choice but to act according to Ancestor Yao Han's words. He looked at the source of the inspiration, which was his target, and immediately went there. In the beginning, he was still very relaxed, but very soon he felt a resistance. He was already prepared for this, and he also knew that once he decided to move, it was impossible for him to stop. So, he did not stop at all and rush deeper. However, as his mana surged, the aura that he had concealed earlier was also exposed. Jizhuang Daoren had been looking for Yuan Mei, so he immediately sensed it and looked over. But when he saw that Yuan Mei was going to the source of the inspiration, he couldn't help but be surprised. But he soon felt something was wrong, because Yuan Mei had exposed himself. Not only would he know, but that existence could also feel it. It could come out and devour Yuan Mei at any time. There was no way Yuan Mei didn't know this, but he was still taking such a big risk. There must be a purpose here, and it was so big that it didn't fear him. Could it be that it wanted the source of the inspiration? His expression became serious. A treasure spirit couldn't do this, but if there was someone else behind it, it would be hard to determine the result. The problem now was that he couldn't interfere because Yuan Mei would be fine, but if he went, it would lead to unpredictable consequences. So he couldn't do anything and could only watch. Zhang Yan suddenly opened his eyes. Just now, he felt a strange movement. He knew that something was happening, and it might involve that existence. He had a premonition about this, but after repeatedly divining it, he found it difficult to determine. Moreover, there were pros and cons, so he didn't act recklessly. At this time, he also saw Yuan Mei's figure rushing towards the source of the inspiration, and he immediately recognized its origin from the mana fluctuation. He also instantly determined that there was an ulterior motive. He silently calculated in his heart. If he went forward now, he could stop it, but first, he couldn't determine its real intention. Secondly, his heart told him that it was best not to interfere at this moment, so he sat and watched. At this moment, Yuan Mei had already rushed to the extreme depths of the spiritual aura fluctuation. Logically speaking, if he got close to this place, he would not be able to advance any further unless his mighty power could suppress the opposite side. However, using some unknown method, his figure actually did not slow down at all. In an instant, he passed through the obstruction, reached out his hand, and grabbed the source of the spiritual aura. Chapter 2154. Yuan Mo was able to pass through so smoothly because he had a trace of divine will on him. It was a gift from Patriarch Yao Han, but it wasn't his divine will, so he didn't know who it belonged to. In truth, he didn't completely believe Patriarch Yao Han's words, but he knew that if he didn't take the risk, he would be found by Ji Zhuang sooner or later. Most importantly, he couldn't leave Yao Han's help during his escape. This had been the case since the beginning, so he couldn't stop now. However, he didn't expect the divine will fruit to be so useful. Just now, he easily broke through the last layer of resistance. He stretched out his hand, and without any mishaps, he grabbed the item that was releasing spiritium. He remembered what Patriarch Yao Han had told him. Once he held onto the lotus, the mighty force around him would stop for a moment, and Ji Zhuang would most likely come to stop him. That was why he had to use the lotus's power to defend himself. That was why he didn't hesitate to pour his consciousness into the lotus as soon as he got his hands on it. He had never controlled creation Pauline before, but the moment he grabbed it, the trace of divine will seeped into it. At that moment, the spiritium suddenly stopped moving. Then an unprecedented whaley ripple spread out like a shockwave, colliding with creation Pauline's power, which had been immersed in nothingness. At that moment, not only did all the spirit refinement cultivators feel the suppression on their cultivation weakening, even the restriction on their Tao laws loosened. It was as if some barrier had been torn apart, and an unknown power seeped out from that hole. Patriarch Yao Han had been waiting for this moment since Yuan Mo entered the depths of the Spiritium. He smiled deeply and didn't do anything else. With just a breath, he received the power, and his aura surged. However, as if to prevent Ji Zhuang from discovering it, he quickly suppressed it, but his own Weili power was undoubtedly increasing rapidly. This situation was not like he had received external help. Instead, it was more like the power that he had lost had been found. Zhang Yan's gaze was incomparably deep as he watched these changes. At the moment when he was shaken by the silence, he had also seen something. He could sense that the item that was beneficial to him had fallen here. At the same time, the avatar that was trapped at the bottom of the lake felt its body shake. It suddenly felt the restraints on its body loosen. It knew that it was time to escape. He was also pleasantly surprised. He didn't expect the person who passed the message to him to be able to do this. Although he could hide here from the pursuit of the original Master God, as an independent consciousness, if he could escape, why would he be willing to be suppressed here? Just as he was about to escape, he suddenly thought of something. The mirror lake was completely defenseless and no one expected him to escape. If he forcefully inhaled a mouthful of it, he would definitely be able to obtain a lot of benefits from this land of creation. It would also shorten the distance between him and the original Lord God. However, he also thought that if Jizhuang Daoren reacted, he might be suppressed again. At this moment, a crazed look appeared in his eyes. Even if he was suppressed again, even if he only inhaled a mouthful of creation essence qi, his strength would increase. Moreover, things might not be as bad as he thought. Ji Zhuang didn't have the time to care about him now. Thinking of this, he didn't hesitate at all. He sucked hard and immediately swallowed a large amount of creation essence qi into his body. Jizhuang Daoren immediately sensed the movement behind him. He frowned. He couldn't free himself now because the creation Pauline in his hand wasn't complete. His strength wasn't as strong as his opponent's. If he was overpowered by his opponent, he could forget about turning the tables. The Avatar had indeed found a loophole. The Avatar wasn't too greedy. He thought that he had picked up a bargain and it was time for him to leave. Before he was suppressed, he left a lot of his divine decree outside. Now, he could escape with just a thought. However, at this moment, he was surprised to find that there was a strand of divine decree in Yuan Mo's hand. He saw that Yuan Mo was holding a golden Pauline. Without a doubt, this was the creation Pauline. However, he didn't know why his divine decree could do this. It was as if everything related to this place was a blank. Seeing this, he suddenly had an idea. If he could take the creation Pauline and hold it in his hand, he wouldn't have to fear the original Lord God and Jizhuang Daoren anymore. Previously, he had already missed an opportunity and was instead schemed against by Jizhuang. This time, he could not afford to fail. Thinking of this, he turned his divine decree and sent it to where Yuan Mo was. As soon as it appeared, it easily took the Pauline into its body. Yuan Mo was caught off guard. After all, he wasn't the owner of the creation Pauline. He had to rely on the strand of divine decree to control it. Now that the owner of the creation divine decree had returned, he was immediately pushed away by a resisting force. He immediately knew that things were bad and tried to contact ancestor Yao Han. However, before he could do so, a figure appeared behind him and wrapped him up. The figure's aura disappeared in an instant. The figure that appeared was the existence that hadn't appeared for a long time. The spirit refinement cultivators who saw this scene were all shocked. They did not expect this person to appear as well. The Avatar also saw the appearance of the original Lord God, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he picked up the creation Pauline and activated its power, waving it in the direction of the Avatar. The Avatar's figure couldn't help but tremble and dim a little. However, when it stabilized, it didn't retreat. Instead, it rushed towards the Avatar. However, it was clearly blocked by the resisting force coming from the creation Pauline. It couldn't get close. The Avatar was overjoyed when it saw that this method worked. It continuously activated the creation Pauline Weili. Under the impact, the Avatar's figure dimmed and its aura weakened. However, it knew that this was only a temporary suppression. As long as the power he activated weakened a little, the original Lord God would immediately recover. If it wanted to completely resolve this matter, it would have to devour it. With this thought in mind, the Avatar's eyes became fierce. Once the two sides got entangled, Taoist Zhizhuang felt much more relaxed. He immediately stabilized the power of the world that the Lotus of Good Fortune had been infused with. This was related to a huge matter that he had planned, and it could not be disrupted. However, a bad feeling suddenly rose in his heart. He looked into the depths of the mighty force and realized the divine clone's intention. His expression could not help but change slightly. If the two were to reunite and he had the creation Pauline, how could he fight against it? He absolutely couldn't let that happen. So, he kept activating the creation Pauline in his hand in an attempt to stop it. However, he soon discovered that although he could neutralize the outermost layer of the Whaley, he couldn't shake the innermost layer of the Whaley. Even if he summoned everyone in the lake, it would be useless. He muttered to himself for a moment, then sent his thoughts into the ripples of mana. He said to Zhang Yan, "Fellow Taoist, please help me. If the original master's soul is swallowed by the avatar, it will transform back into the original person. Moreover, it will be even more difficult to deal with than the original one with the lotus." Zhang Yan pondered for a moment. No matter which side won the battle in the depths of the Whaley, it wouldn't be a good thing. Since it had already happened in his favor, there was no need to wait any longer. No matter what plan Zhizhuang Daoren had, he needed to maintain a calm appearance before it was completed. Coincidentally, he also needed some spare time to digest what he had obtained just now. So, at least for now, the Avatar's interests could be said to be the same as his. So, he also transmitted his thoughts, "I will lend you a hand." After receiving his reply, Zhizhuang Daoren immediately activated the creation Pauline Whaley. At the same time, he ordered everyone in the lake to help him. Seeing his actions, Zhang Yan also activated the power of his Whaley and Bu Shutian. At the same time, he transmitted his thoughts to Xin Chang, Zhan Yuan, Qing Sheng, and the others, asking them to cooperate with him. With the two sides working together, the obstructing force in front of them was pushed away and continued to move towards the depths. At this moment, the Avatar was suddenly faced with pressure from two sides. He didn't know which side to deal with first. He didn't expect Zhizhuang and Zhang Yan to be able to compete with him. More importantly, he couldn't easily retreat under the pressure of these two forces. He thought about it. Even if Zhizhuang captured him, he would only be suppressed again. The threat of the original God of Lords was greater. As long as he devoured it, he would immediately have the power to fight against Zhizhuang and Zhang Yan. So, he decided to ignore the attacks of these two and focused most of his power on the original God of Lords. At this time, Zhang Yan calculated. According to the current situation, when they rushed to the depths, the Avatar would definitely succeed. Therefore, he needed to add more power, even if it was just a little. As he thought of this, he came out of Bu Shutian's body and took out the lotus petal from his spirit's will. At the same time, he activated the mighty force within it. The addition of his power immediately broke the deadlock. Zhizhuang Daoren seized this opportunity and rushed forward, suppressing the power of the Avatar. The latter was like being overturned by a wave and was instantly submerged. When that existence saw this, his figure faded away silently just like how he came. Clearly, he knew that he was no match for Zhang Yan and Taoist Zhizhuang. Zhang Yan shifted his gaze and saw that Bao Lian had escaped from the spiritual clone's control and was floating far away. Moreover, it was beginning to generate inspiration again. When he saw this, he could not help but fall into deep thought. After Zhizhuang Daoren suppressed the Avatar again, he saw him looking at the creation Pauline and said, "Fellow Taoist, it's best not to touch this thing." Zhang Yan said indifferently, "I naturally know that there is a great deal of responsibility here. If I wanted to take it by force, I would have done it long ago. However, it seems that this creation Pauline is held by the Vedanta that entrusted its consciousness, so it should come from the same place as that existence. But if this is the case, this thing has long been here, why does that existence not have the slightest intention of taking it?" Zhizhuang Daoren said in a low voice, What fellow Taoist said is right. If that existence had held this Pauline long ago, then none of us would have been his opponent. I'm afraid that we could have taken it long ago. But that Vedanta would absolutely not do so, because once the entrusted consciousness holds the Pauline, it may give birth to its own self and will no longer be able to bring it back. Zhang Yan nodded slightly. Sure enough, this was the reason. This was consistent with his inference. At this time, he raised his head and glanced at a certain place. His eyes were deep. He could sense that even though this matter had been resolved peacefully, the conflict between the two treasured lotuses had caused some things to change forever. You're tuning in to the Passion Pages YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.